A woman stood alone on the porch facing three armed men. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the yard, painting the scene in stark contrasts of light and darkness. Wind rustled through the cottonwoods, carrying with it the scent of dust and approaching rain. "I'm not afraid of you anymore," she said, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. "And fear was the only weapon you ever really had." The man across from her, elegantly dressed with cold eyes that had witnessed a lifetime of broken spirits, reached slowly for his pistol. His lips curled into something between a smile and a sneer. "A pity you've chosen this path, Miss Clara," he said. "Some lessons must be learned the hard way." As his fingers closed around the grip of his weapon, a gunshot shattered the tense silence. But the shot hadn't come from his gun. 6 months earlier, the morning sun had barely crested the eastern hills when Clara Abernathy stepped out of the weathered farmhouse. At 24, she moved with the careful efficiency of someone accustomed to measuring each action against an impossible standard. Her brown hair was pulled back in a simple knot at the nape of her neck, practical rather than pretty. The dress she wore had been mended so many times that the original fabric was more memory than reality, but it was clean and serviceable, like Clara herself. The barn stood 50 yards from the house, its red paint faded to the color of dried blood. Inside, the familiar smells of hay leather and horses greeted her, the only welcome she could count on at Abernathy Ranch. "Good morning, Willow," Clara whispered, approaching the stall where an aging gray mare stood waiting. The horse nickered softly, pushing her velvet muzzle against Clara's outstretched palm. "Did you sleep well, old girl?" Willow had been destined for the slaughterhouse when Clara had found her 3 years ago. Too old for hard work, too plain for showing, the mare had been deemed worthless by everyone except Clara, who recognized something in those gentle eyes, a quiet dignity that refused to be diminished by others' assessments. As she brushed Willow's dappled coat, Clara began to hum softly, the sound barely audible, even in the quiet barn. The melody was one her mother had sung a lullaby about meadowlarks and morning skies. Clara only sang when she was alone with the horses. Her father had made it clear years ago that her voice was just one more disappointing thing about her. "Too much like your mother," he'd spat once when he caught her singing while hanging laundry. "Filling your head with nonsense instead of doing honest work." The memory stung as fresh as if it had happened yesterday instead of 8 years ago. Josephine Abernathy had possessed a voice that could, according to town legend, make angels weep with envy. Before coming west, she'd performed in saloons and theaters across St. Louis, enchanting audiences with her clear soprano and arresting presence. What had made such a woman choose Malcolm Abernathy, a hard-working but ordinary rancher, with nothing to offer but calloused hands and ambitious dreams, remained a mystery to Clara. And why, after 12 years of marriage, Josephine had succumbed to fever one harsh winter, taking with her all the music and warmth from their home, was a wound that had never properly healed. Clara finished brushing Willow and moved on to feeding the other horses. The Abernathy Ranch wasn't large by territory standards, just enough land to run a modest herd of cattle and grow hay for winter feed, but it demanded constant attention. Every fence post, every water trough, every acre represented hours of labor that Clara shared with her father, though rarely alongside him. "You're wasting daylight again." Malcolm Abernathy's voice cut through the peaceful morning like a blade. He stood in the barn doorway, silhouetted against the brightening sky, his tall frame still straight despite approaching 50. Once handsome in a rugged way, years of bitterness had carved deep lines around his mouth and eyes, giving him a perpetually disapproving expression. "I've fed and watered all but the last 2 stalls," Clara replied, keeping her voice neutral. Experience had taught her that emotion of any kind, defensiveness, anger, especially tears, only fueled her father's contempt. "Then you should be done already." He stepped into the barn boots, leaving imprints in the scattered hay. "Sullivan's coming by later to look at that bay gelding. Make yourself scarce when he's here. No need to scare off a potential buyer with that sullen face of yours." The casual cruelty landed with practiced precision. Clara kept her eyes on her task, not giving him the satisfaction of seeing how the words wounded her. "Yes, sir, I'll be checking the south pasture fence." "See that you do." He turned to leave, then paused. "And for God's sake, put on something decent if Martha comes with him. That dress looks like it was made from a feed sack." It had been, in fact, one of Clara's careful repurposing projects, but she said nothing as her father walked away. Arguments never ended well, and the day was already long enough without adding fresh bruises to her spirit. When he was gone, Clara leaned her forehead against Willow's neck, drawing comfort from the steady warmth of the animal. The mare stood patiently as if understanding the silent exchange of strength between them. One day, Clara whispered so quietly that even the dust motes dancing in the sunlight couldn't hear, one day things will be different. The general store sat at the center of Cedar Ridge, a two-story building that served as the heart of the small frontier community. Martha Sullivan had run the establishment since her husband James had injured his back 5 years prior, transforming what had been a simple trading post into a gathering place that rivaled the church for social importance. At 48, Martha possessed the kind of warmth that drew people to her like moths to flame. Her ample figure and ready smile created an atmosphere of welcome that made even the most taciturn rancher linger over purchases, sharing news and seeking advice. She had been Josephine's closest friend, and after her death had extended that fierce loyalty to Clara despite Malcolm's clear disapproval. "There you are, child," Martha called, as Clara entered the store, the bell above the door announcing her arrival. "I was beginning to think you wouldn't make it to town today." Clara offered a small smile, genuine if reserved. "South pasture fence needed more work than I expected. 3 posts rotted clean through." Martha clicked her tongue sympathetically, her eyes taking in Clara's appearance with motherly concern. The girl looked tired, shadows beneath her eyes suggesting nights of poor sleep. Her capable hands were raw from work, and though she carried herself with quiet dignity, there was a wariness to her movements that broke Martha's heart. "Well, you're here now. Come into the back and have some tea while I finish with Mrs. Peterson." The older woman at the counter, rail-thin with a perpetually pinched expression, sniffed disapprovingly. Edith Peterson had appointed herself Cedar Ridge's moral guardian, and in her estimation, Clara Abernathy fell well short of acceptable standards. The fact that the girl lived alone with her father, worked like a man in the fields, and rarely attended social functions marked her as somehow suspect. Clara nodded politely to Mrs. Peterson and slipped behind the counter through the curtained doorway that led to the Sullivans' private quarters. The small sitting room beyond was a haven of comfort, braided rugs covering the plank floor, cushioned chairs arranged around a pot-bellied stove, and shelves lined with books and small treasures collected over a lifetime. Clara sank into a chair with a sigh that seemed to come from her very bones. Here in this room, she could briefly set down the armor she wore everywhere else. A few minutes later, Martha bustled in carrying a tray with a teapot and 2 cups. "That woman," she muttered, setting the tray on a small table, "would find fault with the Almighty himself if he walked into her parlor with dusty boots." Clara smiled, accepting the steaming cup Martha offered. "She means well." "She means to mind everyone's business but her own," Martha corrected, settling her substantial form into the chair opposite. "Now then, how are things really at the ranch?" The simple question, asked with genuine concern, nearly undid Clara's careful composure. She stared into her tea, gathering herself. "The same," she finally said. "Father is father." Martha's expression softened. "And you? How are you bearing up?" "I'm fine." "Clara Abernathy, you've been fine for 12 years. I've known fence posts with more honest answers." Despite herself, Clara laughed, a small, rusty sound that suggested disuse. "What would you have me say, Martha? That I'm tired. That sometimes I dream of just walking away and never looking back. What good would that do?" "Might do you a world of good to admit you're human, for one thing." Martha reached across and patted Clara's knee. "And it might remind you that you deserve better than Franigman." Before Clara could respond, Martha rose and crossed to a small cabinet. From inside, she withdrew a paper-wrapped package. "I've been saving this for you," she said, returning to place it in Clara's hands. "Go on, open it." Clara carefully unwrapped the paper, revealing a bar of lavender soap, the expensive kind from back east that cost more than most people in Cedar Ridge would spend on such a luxury. The scent rose up between them, clean and sweet and utterly feminine. "Martha, I can't." "You can and you will." Martha's tone brooked no argument. A young lady deserves to smell like something other than horse sweat and hay dust, no matter what certain people might think. The kindness brought unexpected tears to Clara's eyes. In a world where her father's criticism had become the steady drumbeat of her days, Martha's small gestures of care felt like rays of sunshine breaking through storm clouds. "Thank you," Clara whispered, clutching the soap to her chest. "Don't thank me, child. Just use it." Martha's weathered hands reached out to cup Clara's face. Your mama was the most beautiful woman in 3 counties inside and out. Don't you let anybody convince you that apple fell far from the tree." The mention of her mother sent a pang through Clara's heart. Grief mingled with a longing so profound it felt physical. "I miss her," she said simply. "I know you do, so do I." Martha's eyes grew distant with memory. Josephine had a light in her that this dusty old territory couldn't dim. When she sang, she shook her head, unable to find adequate words. Well, when she sang, even the mockingbirds stopped to listen. Clara tucked the soap carefully into her pocket alongside a small pouch of peppermint drops Martha had slipped her on her previous visit. These small treasures hidden from her father's disparaging gaze were among her few indulgences. "James says you saved that old gray mare of yours," Martha said, changing the subject. "Says she's the healthiest he's seen her in years." Clara nodded, a small measure of pride warming her chest. Willow just needed someone to believe she was worth saving. The liniment I made from Ma's old recipe book helped with her joints, and the special feed mix put weight back on her. Martha studied her thoughtfully. "You've got your mother's touch, Clara, not just with animals, but with healing. Josephine always knew which herb would bring down a fever or ease a cough. Saved half the town during that influenza outbreak before you were born." "Father says it's superstitious nonsense," Clara Bowen said quietly. "Your father says a lot of things." Martha's voice took on an edge. "Doesn't make them true." The shop bell jingled, signaling another customer. Martha sighed. "Duty calls. You finish that tea and take these biscuits with you when you go. You're too thin by half." As Martha disappeared through the curtain, Clara leaned back in the chair, allowing herself a moment of peace. These visits sustained her reminders that somewhere in the world someone saw her as worthy of kindness. If only that were enough to silence the voice in her head, her father's voice, that constantly whispered she was too plain, too awkward, too much and too little, all at once to ever be truly loved. The weekly social gathering at Cedar Ridge's community hall had always been more ordeal than pleasure for Clara. This particular Saturday evening felt especially daunting as she stood near the back wall, watching young couples twirl across the wooden floor to the lively fiddle music. She wouldn't have come at all if her father hadn't insisted. "Time you stopped hiding away like some kind of hermit," he'd said that morning. "People are starting to talk." What Malcolm didn't say, but Clara clearly understood, was that he enjoyed displaying his disappointment publicly. He relished the way other fathers looked at their own daughters with renewed appreciation after witnessing his burden. Clara wore her best dress, dark blue cotton, that had belonged to her mother, carefully altered to accommodate her fuller figure. Martha had helped with the adjustments, her skilled fingers working magic to make the garment both modest and flattering. The lavender soap had left Clara's skin soft and sweetly scented, though she doubted anyone would get close enough to notice. The hall buzzed with conversation and laughter, children darting between adults, with faces flushed from excitement and too much cake. The older folks settled into chairs along the walls, observing and commenting on the younger generation's behavior, with a mixture of indulgence and critique. Clara spotted her father across the room, engaged in conversation with James Sullivan and the town banker. Malcolm had cleaned up well for the event, his Sunday clothes pressed and his beard neatly trimmed. From a distance, he looked like any respectable rancher enjoying a community gathering, no hint of the bitter, cruel man who emerged behind closed doors. "Quite a turnout tonight," Martha said, appearing at Clara's side with 2 cups of punch. She handed one to Clara, her eyes twinkling with the kind of mischief that had made her a favorite among Cedar Ridge's children for more than 30 years. "Have you seen our newest arrival?" Clara followed Martha's gaze to a tall figure standing near the refreshment table. Even among the other men, most of whom worked physically demanding jobs, this stranger stood out. He had to be at least 6.5 feet tall, with broad shoulders and the kind of quiet presence that seemed to command attention without effort. "That's Nathaniel Hargrove," Martha continued, not bothering to lower her voice. "Rode in yesterday looking for work. James says he handles horses like he was born in the saddle." Clara watched as Sarah Beth Collins, the banker's pretty daughter, approached the newcomer. With her cornflower blue eyes, tiny waist, and golden curls, Sarah Beth embodied everything Clara was not. She was the kind of delicate beauty that made men write poetry and fight duels. "Look at that!" Her father's voice cut through her observations like a rusty blade. Malcolm had positioned himself beside Clara, his expression unreadable but his intent clear. Even a drifter knows quality when he sees it. Smart man, paying attention to the Collins girl. Her daddy's got money and influence, the kind of connections that could set a fellow up for life. Clara remained silent, knowing from experience that any response would only provide more ammunition. Of course, some folks don't have the good sense to recognize their limitations. He continued, his eyes scanning the room with cold assessment. Take poor Mary Sullivan over there mooning after young Tom Brennan like she's got a chance in hell. Girl's got a face like a horse and twice the appetite, but her mama keeps pushing her forward like she's some kind of prize. Clara's cheeks burned with humiliation. She knew exactly where this conversation was heading, could already feel the familiar weight of her father's disapproval settling across her shoulders like a yoke. At least Mary's got prospects. Malcolm went on, warming to his theme. Her father's got that big spread up north, and she's the only child. Man might overlook a lot for the promise of good land. He turned to face Clara fully, his voice dropping to what he probably imagined was a kindly tone. But you've got nothing to offer but a sharp tongue and an appetite that would bankrupt a smaller man. The words hit her like physical blows, each one carefully chosen to inflict maximum damage. Around them, conversations continued, but Clara could feel the surreptitious glances, the pitying looks from women who thank God daily that their own daughters possess more traditional feminine charms. Of course I blame myself, Malcolm continued, his voice rising again, as if the thought had just occurred to him. Should have remarried when you were younger, found you a mother who could have taught you the things a woman needs to know. He shook his head sadly, playing the part of the grieving widower to perfection. But after losing Josephine, I suppose I let sentiment get in the way of practicality. Across the room, Nathaniel Hargrove's attention had shifted from Sarah Beth Collins to the conversation taking place near the wall. His steel-gray eyes found Clara's face, and she saw something flicker in their depths. Recognition, perhaps, or understanding. Whatever it was, it made her stomach clench with fresh humiliation. The thing is, Malcolm was saying, his voice now carrying clearly across the immediate area, a man wants a woman who can make him proud, someone he can show off to his friends and neighbors, someone who will give him strong sons and manage his household with grace and economy. He gestured vaguely in Clara's direction without actually looking at her. What man wants to saddle himself with a wife who eats him out of house and home and scares the livestock with her sullen disposition? The laughter that followed was scattered and uncomfortable, but it was laughter nonetheless. Clara felt each chuckle like a needle pricking her skin, drawing blood from wounds that never quite healed before being opened again. Truth is, Malcolm continued, apparently oblivious to his daughter's distress, some women just aren't meant for marriage and motherhood. It's not their fault exactly. The Lord has his reasons for making some folks differently, but facts are facts, and the sooner a person accepts their lot in life, the easier things get for everyone involved. He paused, letting his words sink in before delivering the final blow. Take Clara here, he said, finally acknowledging her presence with a careless wave of his hand. 24 years old and never so much as had a beau. Smart girl, good with horses, but let's be honest, she's going to die alone without sons to carry on the family name. No point pretending otherwise. The silence that followed was deafening. Clara felt as though every person in the hall was staring at her, their faces reflecting everything from pity to relief that they weren't in her position. She wanted to run, to disappear into the night and never face another human being as long as she lived. Instead, she stood frozen in place, her hands clenched so tightly at her sides that her nails drew blood from her palms. That's when Nathaniel Hargrove moved. He crossed the room with the purposeful stride of a man who had made a decision and intended to see it through. Conversation stopped mid-sentence as people tracked his progress, the crowd parting before him like water before the prow of a ship. When he reached Clara, he stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she could smell the clean scent of soap and leather that clung to his clothes. A brass compass hung from his vest pocket, the metal gleaming like a star against the dark fabric. Miss Abernathy, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the sudden hush, I'd be honored if you'd accept my proposal of marriage. The words fell into the silence like stones into still water, sending ripples of shock throughout the assembled crowd. Clara stared up at him, certain she had misheard, that the stress of her father's public humiliation had finally caused her mind to snap completely. I beg your pardon, she whispered. Nathaniel's gray eyes never left her face. "I'm asking you to be my wife," he said simply. "If you'll have me." Behind him, Clara could see the faces of the crowd. Sarah Beth Collins with her mouth hanging open in shock. Mrs. Patterson clutching her chest as if she might faint. Harrison, the town physician, wearing an expression of surprised approval. But it was her father's face that drew her attention, the way his practiced smile had frozen to something brittle and dangerous. "Now see here." Malcolm began stepping forward with the bluster of a man whose authority had been challenged. "No game," Nathaniel interrupted, his gaze still fixed on Clara. "I heard what you said about your daughter, Mr. Abernathy, about how she'll die alone. I'm here to tell you that you're wrong." He reached into his vest pocket and withdrew the brass compass, its surface worn smooth by countless hands. "This belonged to my father," he said, pressing it into Clara's trembling fingers. "He told me it would always point me toward true north, toward the thing I needed most. Today it led me to you." The compass was warm from his body heat, its weight solid and reassuring in her palm. Clara looked down at it, then back up into Nathaniel's face, searching for some sign that this was all an elaborate joke. "I don't understand," she managed. "Don't need to understand," he replied gently. "Just need to say yes or no. Will you marry me, Clara Abernathy?" The use of her given name, spoken with such quiet respect, nearly undid her completely. When was the last time someone had said her name like it mattered, like it belonged to a person worthy of consideration? "You don't know me," she protested weakly. "I know enough." His voice remained steady, patient. "I know you're gentle with horses. I know you work harder than most men twice your size. I know you've got kind hands and a good heart, and that's more than most folks can say." Around them, the crowd pressed closer, straining to hear every word of this unprecedented drama. Clara could feel their collective breath on her neck, their excitement at witnessing something that would be talked about for years to come. "This is ridiculous," Malcolm sputtered, his face flushing red with embarrassment and rage. "You've known her for less than a day. You can't possibly—" "With respect, sir," Nathaniel said, finally turning his attention to Malcolm. "I don't recall asking your opinion. I'm asking your daughter." The quiet authority in his voice silenced Malcolm more effectively than any shout could have done. For the first time in Clara's memory, her father seemed to shrink his bluster, deflating like a punctured balloon. Nathaniel turned back to her, and the expression on his face was so gentle, so utterly without mockery, that it made her chest ache with hope and terror in equal measure. "What do you say, Clara? Will you take a chance on a wandering cowboy who thinks you're worth more than all the pretty girls in 3 counties? The compass seemed to pulse in her hand, its metal warming under her touch. She thought of her mother's wedding ring, hidden away in a drawer, like a broken promise. She thought of all the years of her father's criticism, all the nights she'd lain awake wondering if she truly was as worthless as he claimed. And then she looked into Nathaniel Hargrove's steady gray eyes and saw something she'd never seen directed at her before: genuine respect, honest admiration, and the promise of protection without conditions. "Yes," she whispered, the word barely audible above the pounding of her heart. "Yeah," he asked, leaning closer to hear her better. "Yeah," she said again, stronger this time. "Yes, I'll marry you." The smile that spread across Nathaniel's face was like sunrise after the longest night of winter. He reached for her free hand and lifted it to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles that sent shivers racing up her arm. "Then it's settled," he announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. "Miss Clara Abernathy has agreed to become Mrs. Nathaniel Hargrove, and I consider myself the luckiest man in the territory." The explosion of voices that followed threatened to lift the roof from the building. Some folks cheered, others gasped in shock, and more than a few began talking at once, their words tumbling over each other in excitement. But Clara heard none of it. All she could focus on was the warm pressure of Nathaniel's hand holding hers, the solid reality of his presence beside her, and the way he looked at her like she was something precious instead of shameful. For the first time in 12 years since the day her mother died and took all the gentle love out of their house, Clara Abernathy felt like she might actually be worth something after all. The walk home from the social gathering passed in a blur of confusion and disbelief. Malcolm had stormed out immediately after Nathaniel's proposal, leaving Clara to find her own way back to the ranch. It was Martha who finally stepped forward, offering both congratulations and a ride in the Sullivan's wagon. Now, as Clara sat alone in her small bedroom, The enormity of what had happened began to settle over her like a heavy quilt. She had agreed to marry a man she'd never spoken to before tonight, a complete stranger who had witnessed her humiliation and responded with an act so unexpected it still didn't seem real. The brass compass sat on her bedside table, its needle pointing steadily north, no matter how she turned it. In the dim light of her single oil lamp, the instrument seemed to hold more questions than answers. Why would a man like Nathaniel Hargrove choose her? He was handsome in a rugged way, tall and strong with an air of quiet confidence that suggested he knew exactly who he was and what he wanted. He could have had his pick of women, including the banker's daughter with her dowry and social connections. Yet he had chosen Clara publicly and decisively. It made no sense unless it was pity. The thought sent a cold wave through her body. Perhaps he had seen her father's cruelty and felt sorry for her, the plain, awkward girl being humiliated before the entire town. Perhaps this proposal was nothing more than an impulsive act of chivalry, one he would regret in the cold light of morning. Clara rose from her bed and crossed to the small chest of drawers in the corner of the room. From the bottom drawer beneath her winter clothes, she withdrew a worn wooden box. Inside lay the few treasures she had managed to keep safe from her father's dismissive gaze. Her mother's silver hairbrush, with most of its bristles, missing a faded ribbon from her 10th birthday, a small collection of pretty stones gathered from the creek bed, and beneath these, wrapped in a square of blue silk, her mother's wedding ring. Clara unwrapped it carefully, holding the simple gold band up to catch the lamplight. It was worn thin from years of work, but still beautiful in its simplicity. Her father had given it to her on her 16th birthday, not out of sentiment, but with a derisive comment about how she might as well have it, since no one else would ever give her a ring of her own. Now as she slipped it onto her finger, still too large despite the passing years, Clara wondered what her mother would make of tonight's events. Would Josephine approve of this hasty engagement? Would she understand Clara's desperate grab at a chance for escape for a life where she might be valued instead of constantly found wanting? A soft knock at her bedroom door startled her from her thoughts. "Clara." Her father's voice was dangerously quiet. "We need to talk." She hastily removed the ring and returned it to its hiding place before opening the door. Malcolm stood in the hallway, his expression unreadable in the shadows. The smell of whiskey clung to him, suggesting he'd visited his private stash after returning home. "Yes, Varnum." He pushed past her into the room, looking around as if seeing it for the first time. Perhaps he was. Clara couldn't remember the last time he had entered her private space. "This man," he said, finally turning to face her, "this Hargrove, what do you know about him?" "Nothing," Clara admitted. "I never spoke to him before tonight." Malcolm's eyebrows rose. "And yet you agreed to marry him. Do you have any idea how that makes me look? My daughter throwing herself at the first drifter who pays her any attention." Clara felt a flicker of anger rare enough that it surprised her with its heat. "Is that what concerns you? How it makes you look? Watch your tone, girl." His voice lowered to a warning growl. "I'm still your father, and you're still under my roof. For how much longer?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. Malcolm stared at her for a long moment, his eyes narrowing as if seeing her in a new light. "You think he'll actually go through with it, don't you? You think this stranger is going to ride in like some knight from a storybook and carry you off to a better life?" When Clara didn't respond, he laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Oh, Clara, I thought you were smarter than that. Men like Hargrove don't marry women like you. Not unless they want something." "What could he possibly want from me?" Clara asked, hating the way her voice trembled. Malcolm shrugged. "Land, maybe. The ranch. Could be he heard about Abernathy Holdings and figured the plain daughter was his easiest way to get his hands on it." The suggestion was so absurd that Clara almost laughed. Anyone in town could tell him the ranch is barely staying afloat. There's nothing here worth scheming for. "There's more than you know," Malcolm said, his voice suddenly distant. For a moment, something like genuine concern flickered across his features. Then his expression hardened again. "Listen to me, Clara. Break off this engagement. Tell Hargrove you spoke in haste, that you've reconsidered. And if I don't," Malcolm's jaw tightened, "then you're no longer welcome in this house. You make your choice, your family and home, or a stranger who'll discard you as soon as he gets what he wants." He turned to leave, pausing at the door. "I'm saying this for your own good, Clara. Some dreams aren't meant for people like you. The sooner you accept that, the less it'll hurt when reality comes calling." The door closed behind him with a decisive click, leaving Clara alone with a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. Return to the safety of the known her father's cruelty, the endless work, the slow death of her spirit, or risk everything on a stranger's promise, and the faint flickering hope that somewhere in the world she might find a place where she belonged. In the quiet darkness of her room, Clara reached for the brass compass, its weight solid and reassuring in her palm. The needle pointed north, unwavering and certain. If only her own path forward were so clear. Dawn found Clara in the hayloft wrapped in an old horse blanket, with her mother's battered journal open on her lap. She hadn't slept, her mind too full of conflicting thoughts and emotions to find rest. Instead, she had retreated to the one place where she had always found solace, surrounded by the quiet breathing of horses and the familiar smells of hay and leather. The journal was one of her most precious possessions, a record of Josephine's thoughts and experiences during her first years in Cedar Ridge. Clara had discovered it hidden in the back of her mother's dresser after her death and had kept it secret from her father, instinctively knowing he would destroy this last intimate connection to the woman they had both loved. Now, as the first light of day filtered through the cracks in the barn wall, Clara carefully turned the pages, seeking wisdom or guidance from a voice long silenced. Josephine's elegant handwriting filled each page with observations about frontier life recipes for herbal remedies, and occasional bursts of poetry that revealed the artistic soul trapped in a practical woman's body. As Clara neared the end of the journal, the entry stopping abruptly 3 months before Josephine's death, a folded piece of paper slipped from between the pages and drifted to the floor. Curious, she retrieved it, noting that it was addressed simply, "For Clara when she is old enough to understand." With trembling fingers, she unfolded the letter, her heart racing at the sight of her mother's handwriting, familiar from the journal, yet somehow more intimate when directed specifically to her. "My dearest Clara, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you are old enough to understand what I could never say while I lived. Your father was not always the bitter man you know him to be. When we married, he was gentle and kind, full of dreams for our future together. But life has a way of breaking even the strongest spirits, and I fear that my illness and death will complete a transformation that began long before you were born." Clara paused, trying to reconcile this description with the father she knew, the harsh, critical man who seemed incapable of genuine tenderness. It was like being told that a wolf had once been a loyal hound. The transformation seemed too complete to be believable. "Before you were born, we had a son, your brother. He lived only 3 days, never strong enough to draw proper breath. With him died your father's dreams of passing on the Abernathy name, of raising a boy who would follow in his footsteps and expand what he had built. Though he welcomed you with joy, when you arrived a year later, I think a part of him never recovered from that first loss. A brother." The revelation hit Clara like a physical blow. She had never known, never even suspected, that she had not been an only child. Suddenly, so many things made sense. Her father's constant disappointment, his bitter remarks about her failure to be the son he needed, the way he looked at other men's sons with poorly disguised envy. The gambling began after Thomas died. At first, it was just a way for your father to escape his grief for a few hours, to sit in a smoky room with other men and pretend that life was simple, that the most important thing in the world was the turn of a card. I didn't worry much in those early days. We had enough, and if Malcolm lost a few dollars here and there, what harm could it do? But grief, when not properly tended, is like a wound that festers. What began as an occasional game became a compulsion, and soon your father was riding to town more often, coming home later, the light in his eyes alternating between wild excitement and desperate despair. Clara read on, learning for the first time about the debts her father had accumulated even before her birth, about her mother's increasingly desperate attempts to curb his addiction, about the threats from men in St. Louis that had followed them even to this remote corner of the territory. I tell you these things not to turn you against your father, but to help you understand him. He loves you, Clara, though his pain makes it difficult for him to show it. When he speaks harshly, remember that his words come from his own wounded heart, not from any lack of worth in you. You are everything beautiful about both of us, and someday you will find someone who sees that beauty as clearly as I do. There is one more thing you should know. The men from St. Louis, the ones your father owes money to, they are not ordinary creditors. Their leader, a man named Victor Caldwell, once asked me to marry him back when I was singing in the theaters. When I chose your father instead, Victor swore he would make me regret it. I fear that he has used your father's weakness for gambling to exact his revenge. Be careful, my darling girl. If these men ever come looking, do not trust them no matter what they say or offer. They have no honor, only greed and old grudges that should have died long ago. I pray that you will find it in your heart to forgive your father, not because he deserves it, but because carrying anger will only poison your own happiness. Be the strong, compassionate woman I know you to be, and perhaps someday you can help heal the wounds that have made our family so broken. All my love forever and always, Mother Clara sat motionless, the letter clutched in her hands as the implications of her mother's words sank in. Her father, the man who had belittled and criticized her for as long as she could remember, was not simply cruel by nature. He was broken, shattered by grief and guilt, trapped in a spiral of his own making. It didn't excuse his behavior. Nothing could erase the years of verbal wounds that had shaped Clara's sense of self. But understanding the source of his bitterness changed something fundamental in how she saw him, no longer a tyrant, but a deeply flawed, painfully human man who had lost his way. And these men from St. Louis, this Victor Caldwell who had wanted her mother, were they still out there somewhere holding old debts and older grudges? Was that what her father had meant when he said there was more to the ranch than she knew? As the sun climbed higher, painting the hayloft in stripes of gold, Clara carefully refolded the letter and tucked it into her dress pocket alongside Nathaniel's compass. Two objects, two paths her past and a possible future, both weighted with significance she was only beginning to understand. A sound from below interrupted her thoughts. The main barn door opening, followed by the distinctive tread of boots on packed earth. Her father coming to begin the morning chores. Clara tensed, preparing for another confrontation, another test of wills. But the footsteps paused, and then a different voice called out, deep, steady, and unfamiliar. "Miss Abernathy, are you here?" Nathaniel Hargrove had come looking for his bride-to-be. Clara descended from the hayloft with as much dignity as she could muster, painfully aware of her rumpled dress and hay-strewn hair. Nathaniel stood in the center of the barn, hat in hand, looking as if he had stepped out of one of the dime novels Martha kept hidden beneath the counter at the general store. In the clear morning light, he was even more imposing than he had appeared in the community hall. Tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar, and hands that looked capable of gentling the wildest Mustang or building a homestead from nothing but raw timber and determination. He rode a paint-gelding, black and white patches gleaming in the morning sun, and both horse and rider moved with the fluid grace that spoke of countless miles traveled together. "Mr. Hargrove," Clara said, brushing straw from her skirt, "I wasn't expecting you so early." "Nathaniel, please." His smile was warm, reaching all the way to those remarkable gray eyes. "And I hope you'll forgive the intrusion. I wanted to speak with you before too many opinions and rumors had a chance to take root." There was something about the way he said it, direct, honest, without artifice, that eased some of the tension in Clara's shoulders. Whatever else this man might be, he wasn't a smooth-talking confidence man or a pitying do-gooder. "You've caused quite a stir," she said, unable to keep a note of accusation from her voice. "Everyone in Cedar Ridge will be talking about last night for months." "Let them talk." He stepped closer, his expression serious. "The question is, are you having second thoughts?" The directness of the question caught Clara off guard. She had expected evasion, perhaps even a retraction of the proposal now that the dramatic moment had passed. "I don't even know why you asked me," she admitted. "We're strangers to each other." Nathaniel nodded, acknowledging the truth of her words. "Fair enough. I reckon we've got some getting acquainted to do. But I meant what I said last night, Clara. I'd be honored to have you as my wife." "Why?" The question burst from her like water through a breaking dam. "You could have any woman in 3 counties. Why choose the one everyone else has given up on?" Something flickered across his face, a shadow of emotion she couldn't quite name. "Because I recognize quality when I see it," he said simply. "The way you gentle those horses, the respect Dr. Harrison has for your judgment, the way Martha Sullivan's face lights up when she talks about you, that tells me everything I need to know about the kind of woman you are." Clara stared at him, searching for any sign of deception or hidden motive. But Nathaniel's gaze remained steady, his expression open. "My father thinks you want the ranch," she said, testing him. "Your father's a fool," Nathaniel replied bluntly, then immediately softened his tone. "Forgive me for speaking plainly, but it's the truth. Any man who can't see his daughter's worth isn't fit to judge anyone else's." The words hit Clara like a physical force, not because they were cruel, but because they articulated something she had felt but never dared express even to herself. He wasn't always like this, she found herself saying, the letter's revelations still fresh in her mind. Before my mother died, before my brother died, he was different. Your brother. Nathaniel's eyebrows rose slightly. Clara nodded, touching the pocket where the letter lay hidden. I just found out. He died as a baby before I was born. Father never told me. Grief does strange things to people, Nathaniel said quietly, changes them in ways they don't always recognize themselves. There was something in his voice, a weight of personal experience that made Clara look at him more closely. You sound like you know that from more than just observation. Nathaniel's eyes grew distant, focused on something only he could see. My mother died when I was 14. My father, he wasn't a cruel man, but he was hard. Believed showing too much emotion made a man weak. After she was gone, he got harder, more closed off. Took me years to understand he was just trying to hold himself together the only way he knew how. The shared confidence offered without expectation touched Clara deeply. Here was something genuine, a connection built not on romantic fantasy or desperation, but on the recognition of a common experience. What happened to him, your father? She asked. Died 2 years ago, pneumonia. A shadow crossed Nathaniel's features there, and gone so quickly she might have imagined it. I'd been away working. By the time I got back, he shook his head, unable or unwilling to finish the thought. Clara found herself wanting to reach out to offer comfort. Instead, she asked the question that had been haunting her since the previous night. What do you want from me, Mr. Hargrove, truly? Nathaniel considered her question with the seriousness it deserved. A partner, he said finally. Someone to build a life with. I'm 30 years old, Clara. I've seen enough of the world to know what matters and what doesn't. I've got a bit of money saved enough to buy some land and start a small ranch. What I don't have is someone to share it with, someone with sense and strength and a kind heart. He stepped closer, his gaze never leaving her face. I know this is sudden. I know most folks would say we need time to court proper to make sure we suit each other, but I've never been one for doing things the way other folks think they should be done. The truth of his words rang clear as a bell on a still morning. This wasn't a conventional proposal, and Nathaniel Hargrove wasn't a conventional man. But then Clara had never fit neatly into the conventions of Cedar Ridge society either. I have conditions, she said, surprising herself with her boldness. Nathaniel's lips quirked into a smile. Name them. I want my own garden like my mother used to keep, and I want to bring Willow, my mare. She's not worth much to anyone else, but she matters to me. Of course. What else? Clara took a deep breath, gathering her courage for the most important condition. And I want time. I'll marry you, but I need to know you better before we... Her cheeks flushed hot, but she forced herself to continue. Before we become husband and wife in all ways. If Nathaniel was surprised or disappointed by this stipulation, he didn't show it. Instead, he nodded, his expression serious but not displeased. You have my word, he said. We'll take that part as slow as you need. Marriage is about more than just what happens between a man and woman in the dark. The simple statement, delivered without embarrassment or condescension, eased something tight in Clara's chest. He respected her enough to listen, to consider her needs as valid. One more thing, she said, drawing the compass from her pocket. This, you gave it to me last night, but it obviously means a great deal to you. I can't keep something so personal, not when we barely know each other. Nathaniel looked at the compass, then back at Clara's face. With gentle deliberation, he closed her fingers around the brass instrument. My father gave me that compass when I was 12 years old, he said. Told me it would always point me toward what I needed most, even when I didn't know what that was myself. I'd like you to keep it, at least for now. Think of it as a promise that whatever path we take, we'll find our true north together. The sentiment was so unexpected, so genuinely touching, that Clara found herself blinking back tears. No one had ever spoken to her with such sincerity, such respect for her as a person with thoughts and feelings that mattered. Then I accept, she said, her voice steadier than she would have thought possible. Both the compass and your proposal. Nathaniel's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, warm and full of promise. In that case, he said, perhaps we should discuss when this wedding might take place. Clara glanced toward the house where she knew her father would be watching from the window, his face set in lines of disapproval and anger. After last night's ultimatum, there was no going back to the life she had known. Soon, she said, as soon as it can be arranged. The carved wooden horse appeared on Clara's windowsill 3 days before their wedding, catching the morning light like a small miracle. She discovered it while preparing breakfast, the smooth maple gleaming golden in the dawn rays that slanted through the kitchen window. It was exquisite work no larger than her palm, but every detail lovingly rendered the flowing mane, the delicate curve of the neck, the way the figure seemed poised to leap into motion at any moment. Even the tiny hooves were perfectly formed, polished to a soft sheen that spoke of countless, careful hours. A piece of paper lay folded beneath the carving, and Clara's hands trembled slightly as she opened it to reveal Nathaniel's careful script. For the woman who understands that beauty comes from strength, not size, every horse should be so lucky as to have your gentle hands. She pressed the note to her chest, overwhelmed by the thoughtfulness of the gift. In her 24 years, no one had ever made something just for her, crafted with such care and attention to detail. The wooden horse seemed to capture everything Nathaniel had come to mean to her in the short time since his proposal. Strength and grace combined, wild beauty, tamed by gentle patience. "What's that you've got there?" Malcolm's voice cut through her reverie like a blade. She turned to find him standing in the doorway, his hair still mussed from sleep, and his expression already settling into its familiar lines of disapproval. "Nothing important," she said quickly, slipping the horse into her apron pocket alongside the brass compass that had become her constant companion. But Malcolm's sharp eyes had already caught the gleam of polished wood. "Let me see it." There was no refusing when he used that tone. With reluctant fingers, Clara withdrew the carving and placed it on the table between them. Malcolm picked it up, turning it over in his calloused hands with the critical eye of a man who found fault in everything. "Fancy work," he said finally. "Must have taken considerable time to make something like this." "I suppose," Clara replied carefully, uncertain where this conversation was heading. "Time that could have been spent on more practical matters." He set the horse down with deliberate force, though not quite hard enough to damage it. "Man's got to eat after all, got to have a roof over his head and clothes on his back. Doesn't seem wise to waste effort on trinkets when there's real work to be done." The criticism stung as it was meant to. Malcolm had a talent for taking anything that brought Clara joy and finding the flaw within it, the reason she shouldn't allow herself such frivolous happiness. "It was a gift," she said quietly. "Gift?" Malcolm's eyebrows rose in mock surprise. "From your intended, I presume." How thoughtful of him to spend his time whittling toys instead of figuring out how he's going to support a wife. Before Clara could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention toward the front of the house. Through the window, she could see Nathaniel dismounting from his paint gelding, his movements easy and confident despite the early hour. "Speak of the devil," Malcolm muttered, but he straightened his shoulders and arranged his features into a semblance of cordiality as Nathaniel's boots sounded on the porch steps. The knock that followed was firm but respectful, the knock of a man who understood his place but wasn't cowed by it. "Come in," Malcolm called, and Nathaniel entered, removing his hat as he crossed the threshold. "Morning, Mr. Abernathy, Clara." His gray eyes found hers immediately, and the warmth in them made her heart skip. "I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all," Malcolm replied with false heartiness. "Just having our morning coffee. Would you care for a cup?" "That's kind of you, but I can't stay long. I wanted to speak with Clara about the wedding arrangements, if that's all right." "Of course it is. She's your intended after all." Malcolm's smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "Though I notice you've already been leaving her little presents." He gestured toward the wooden horse, and Clara felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. There was something in her father's tone that made the gift sound foolish and impractical, like evidence of poor judgment on Nathaniel's part. But when Nathaniel looked at the carving, his expression remained calm and untroubled. "I hope you like it," he said, simply addressing Clara rather than her father. "I noticed how gentle you are with Willow, and I thought you might appreciate having a horse you could keep with you always." The straightforward honesty of his words diffused whatever criticism Malcolm had been preparing. How could anyone find fault with such simple thoughtfulness? "It's beautiful," Clara said softly. "I've never seen such fine work." "My father taught me to carve when I was a boy," Nathaniel explained. Said idle hands were the devil's playground and a man should always be creating something instead of destroying it. There was wisdom in that philosophy, Clara thought, and she found herself wondering what other lessons Nathaniel either had passed down to his son. The brass compass spoke of a man who valued direction and purpose. The carved horse revealed an artist's soul hidden beneath the cowboy's practical exterior. "Your father sounds like a wise man," she said. He was. A shadow crossed Nathaniel's features there, and gone so quickly she might have imagined it. "He's been gone these past 2 years, but I try to live by the things he taught me." Clara wanted to reach out to offer comfort for the loss that still clearly pained him. But Malcolm's presence made such a gesture impossible. "Well," her father said after a moment, clearly uncomfortable with the emotional undercurrent of the conversation, "I'll leave you two to discuss your plans. I've got cattle to tend." He left the kitchen without another word, and the silence that followed felt heavy with unspoken tensions. Nathaniel waited until the sound of Malcolm's boots had faded before turning back to Clara, his expression gentle but concerned. "Are you all right?" he asked softly. She nodded, though her hands were trembling slightly as she picked up the wooden horse from the table. "He's not usually so. Actually, that's not true. He is usually like this. Clara, you don't have to make excuses for him. Not with me." The kindness in his voice nearly undid her. She'd spent so many years defending her father's behavior, explaining away his cruelties as disappointment or grief, that she'd almost convinced herself they were normal. "He wasn't always like this," she said quietly, her mother's letter burning in her pocket. "Before Mama died, before my brother, he was different." "Grief changes people," Nathaniel acknowledged, "but it doesn't excuse everything, and it shouldn't fall on you to bear the weight of his pain." She looked up into his face, searching for judgment or pity, but found only understanding. "You really mean that, don't you?" "Every word." He reached out and touched her cheek gently, his calloused thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "Tell me about them, your dreams." The request caught her off guard. No one had ever asked her that before, what she wanted, what she hoped for beyond the basic necessities of survival. "I dream about having a garden," she said hesitantly, "like Mama used to keep, with flowers and herbs and vegetables all growing together. I dream about children learning to read at my kitchen table, maybe teaching them the way Mama taught me." Her voice grew stronger as she spoke, the words flowing more freely as Nathaniel listened with genuine interest. "I dream about having a horse of my own, not for work, but just for the feat of riding across open country on a spring morning. And I dream about—" She stopped, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. "What?" he prompted gently. "I dream about being the kind of wife my mother was, the kind who makes a house feel like home, who knows how to comfort and encourage and make ordinary moments feel special." Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight of absolute sincerity. "Those aren't foolish dreams, Clara. They're beautiful ones, and if you'll let me, I'd like to help you make every one of them come true." The promise hung between them like a bridge spanning the gulf between her lonely past and a future bright with possibility. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that this gentle man could truly see value in the dreams she'd held so close to her heart. "The preacher says he can marry us on Saturday." Nathaniel continued, his practical tone belied by the warmth in his eyes. "I've spoken with James Sullivan, and he's offered us the use of a cabin on his property until we can find our own place. It's not much, 2 rooms and a kitchen, but it's clean and sound, with good windows for light." "Saturday," she repeated, testing the word on her tongue. 3 days. 3 days, he confirmed. "Are you ready?" She thought of the quilt folded away in her hope chest, the wedding ring wrapped in silk, the wooden horse warm in her palm. She thought of the cabin on the Sullivan land, small and simple, but theirs alone. "Yes," she said, and for the first time in years, she truly meant it. "I'm ready." Night fell soft and quiet over Cedar Ridge, wrapping the small frontier town in a blanket of stars that stretched from horizon to horizon. In her bedroom, Clara sat before the small mirror that had once belonged to her mother, studying her reflection in the wavering light of a single candle. Tomorrow she would become Mrs. Nathaniel Hargrove. The thought sent a flutter of nerves through her stomach, equal parts excitement and terror. In the span of a week, her entire life had been uprooted and replanted in soil she wasn't entirely sure would nourish it, but there was no going back now. Malcolm had made that abundantly clear, his cold silence more eloquent than any words could have been. He would attend the wedding appearances, must be maintained, but he had shown no interest in the preparations, offered no fatherly advice or encouragement. Clara had spent the day packing her few possessions, carefully wrapping her mother's silver hairbrush and the wooden horse Nathaniel had carved. Martha had helped bringing a basket of practical household items, linens, cooking utensils, packets of seeds for the garden Clara hoped to plant. Every bride needs a proper trousseau, Martha had said firmly, brushing aside Clara's protests. James and I consider it our wedding gift to you both. Now in the quiet of her last night under her father's roof, Clara opened the bottom drawer of her dresser and removed her most precious possession, her mother's hope chest. Made of cedar and decorated with simple carved flowers, the small chest contained the tangible remains of Josephine Abernathy's dreams. Inside lay the quilt Clara had been working on in secret for 2 years, a double wedding ring pattern pieced together from scraps of fabric she'd salvaged from worn-out dresses and household linens. Every stitch had been taken during stolen moments when her father was away from the house, every piece cut and arranged with the desperate hope that someday she might have a home of her own to make beautiful. Beneath the quilt was her mother's worn Bible, its pages filled with pressed flowers and handwritten notes. And wrapped in blue silk, the simple gold band that had once graced Josephine's finger, the ring Malcolm had given to Clara with such casual disdain. Clara unwrapped it carefully, studying the worn metal in the candlelight. Despite her father's dismissive gesture, in giving it to her, the ring represented something precious, a link to her mother, a symbol of the kind of love she hoped to find with Nathaniel. A soft knock at her door startled her from her thoughts. She hastily rewrapped the ring and tucked it back into the chest before calling, "Come in." The door opened to reveal Malcolm, his tall frame blocking the light from the hallway. For a moment, he simply stood there looking at his daughter, as if trying to memorize her features. "You should be asleep," he said finally, his voice gruff. "Big day tomorrow." "I know, I was just—" She gestured vaguely toward the packed bags beside her bed. Malcolm stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. In the dim light, he looked suddenly older, the lines in his face deeper, the silver in his hair more pronounced. "Your mother would have known what to say to you tonight," he said, the words seeming to surprise him as much as they did Clara. She always knew the right words. Clara remained silent, afraid that any response might break this unexpected moment of vulnerability. Malcolm moved to the window, looking out at the star-filled sky. "I didn't want this for you," he said after a long moment. "This rushed marriage to a man you barely know." "I know," Clara replied softly. "Do you—" He turned to face her, his expression unreadable in the shadows. "Do you understand what I'm trying to protect you from?" Clara thought of her mother's letter, the warnings about men from St. Louis, about debts and old grudges. "I think so," she said. "But Nathaniel isn't like that. He's a good man." "You can't know that, not yet." Malcolm's voice carried an edge of desperation that Clara had never heard before. "Clara, there are things about this ranch, about our situation, that you don't understand." "Then explain them to me." She stood facing her father with a steadiness that surprised them both. "Tell me the truth for once." For a moment it seemed he might do just that. Something flickered across his face, a decision being weighed, words forming, and then discarded. But then the shutters came down, his expression closing off like a door being slammed. "It doesn't matter now," he said, his voice returning to its familiar coldness. "You've made your choice. Just don't come crying to me when you discover that fairy tales don't exist in the real world." He turned to leave, but paused at the door. "I'll walk you down the aisle tomorrow. People would talk if I didn't. But after that, you're Hargrove's responsibility." The door closed behind him with a finality that echoed in the small room. Clara sank back onto her bed, the brief hope of reconciliation fading like mist in the morning sun. Outside, an owl called into the darkness, its mournful cry floating through the open window. Clara moved to the sill, gazing up at the vast canopy of stars. Somewhere out there, beyond the confines of this house and the weight of her father's disappointment, a new life awaited her. Whether that life would fulfill her dreams or confirm her father's warnings remained to be seen. But one thing was certain tomorrow: for better or worse, Clara Abernathy would become someone new. She opened the window wider, letting the cool night air caress her face. And then very softly she began to sing a lullaby her mother had taught her about meadowlarks and morning skies and the promise of new beginnings. For the first time in years, she didn't worry about who might hear her. The morning of her wedding dawned clear and bright, the kind of perfect autumn day that seemed designed by Providence to mark beginnings. Clara stood in Martha Sullivan's spare bedroom, dressed in a simple white gown that had once belonged to Josephine. Martha had altered it skillfully, letting out seams and adding panels of delicate lace to accommodate Clara's fuller figure. "You look beautiful," Martha said, her eyes suspiciously bright as she adjusted the small crown of wildflowers perched atop Clara's carefully arranged hair. "Absolutely beautiful." Clara gazed at her reflection in the standing mirror, hardly recognizing the woman who gazed back. The dress with its high collar and flowing skirt transformed her usual practical appearance into something almost ethereal. The lavender soap Martha had given her had left her skin soft and sweetly scented, and the morning light streaming through the window cast a golden glow over everything. "Your mother would be so proud," Martha continued, her voice thick with emotion. "She always said you'd bloom when given the right soil, and look at you now, proving her right as usual." Clara smoothed a hand over the worn fabric of her mother's dress, feeling a connection that transcended death. "Do you think I'm doing the right thing?" she asked softly. "Marrying a man I've known for only a week." Martha considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I think," she said finally, "that some souls recognize each other across time and distance. Your parents knew each other 3 weeks before they married, and they were happy, truly happy, until circumstances turned your father into the man he is now." She took Clara's hands in hers, her expression earnest. "I've watched Nathaniel Hargrove these past days. The way he looks at you when you're not watching, the way he listens when you speak, the respect he shows for your thoughts and feelings, these aren't the actions of a man with anything but honorable intentions." Clara nodded, drawing comfort from Martha's assessment. "It's just so sudden. Sometimes I wake up thinking I've dreamed the whole thing." "Life happens suddenly sometimes," Martha said with a smile. "One moment you're walking your familiar path, and the next a door opens that you never knew existed. The question isn't whether it happened too quickly, but whether you're brave enough to walk through that door." A knock at the bedroom door interrupted their conversation. James Sullivan's voice called through the wood, "Ladies, the preacher's here and the guests are arriving. It's almost time." Martha gave Clara's hands a final squeeze. "Are you ready?" Clara took a deep breath, thinking of Nathaniel waiting for her, of the life they would build together, of all the dreams she had kept hidden for so long that might now have a chance to flourish. "Yes," she said, her voice steady and sure. "I'm ready." The small church at the edge of Cedar Ridge had been transformed for the occasion. Late autumn wildflowers adorned the altar and windows, their vibrant colors a defiant last stand against the approaching winter. Nearly everyone in town had come, drawn by curiosity as much as by genuine goodwill toward the bride and groom. Malcolm waited at the back of the church, his Sunday best brushed and pressed, his face set in an expression of rigid control. When he saw Clara, something flickered in his eyes, at a recognition, perhaps, of the daughter he had never truly allowed himself to see. "You look like her," he said, the words barely audible. "Like Josephine." Coming from Malcolm, it was as close to a compliment as Clara had ever received. She nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady if she spoke. The music began, Mrs. Patterson at the church's small organ, playing the traditional wedding march with more enthusiasm than skill. Malcolm offered his arm, and Clara placed her hand upon it, feeling the tension in his muscles as they prepared to walk down the aisle. "It's not too late," he murmured so softly that only she could hear. "You could still change your mind." Clara looked up at her father, seeing beyond the harsh exterior to the frightened, broken man beneath. "I know you think you are protecting me," she whispered, "but I have to live my own life, make my own choices, even if they turn out to be mistakes." For a moment, something like respect showed in Malcolm's eyes. Then the mask descended once more, and he straightened his shoulders. "Let's get this over with, then." They walked down the short aisle together, past the curious faces of neighbors and acquaintances, toward the altar where Nathaniel waited. He stood tall and straight, his usually practical attire replaced by a dark suit that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders and the lean strength of his frame. When he turned to watch Clara's approach, the expression on his face made her heart stutter in her chest. There was awe there, and something deeper, a recognition that mirrored her own growing certainty that this sudden, unexpected union was somehow right, somehow meant to be. At the altar, Malcolm placed Clara's hand in Nathaniel's, the symbolic transfer of responsibility performed with rigid formality. But as he stepped back, Clara thought she saw his fingers brush against the pocket where her mother's wedding ring lay hidden in its silk wrapping, a small, private gesture of connection to the woman they had both loved and lost. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of ancient words and solemn promises. Clara spoke her vows in a clear, steady voice, surprising herself with her own certainty. When Nathaniel slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, knew not her mother's a fresh beginning, rather than a continuation, the weight of it felt right, like a puzzle piece falling into place. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the preacher declared, his voice ringing through the small church. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." As Nathaniel leaned down to seal their union with a kiss, gentle, respectful, but with a promise of deeper passion to come, Clara felt something unfurling within her, like a flower finally finding sunlight after years in shadow. For the first time in her memory, she felt not just accepted, but truly seen and valued, not despite her differences, but because of them. In Nathaniel's eyes, she wasn't Malcolm Abernathy's disappointing daughter, but Clara Hargrove, a woman worthy of respect and admiration. The kiss ended, and they turned to face the congregation as husband and wife. The applause that greeted them was genuine, if somewhat reserved. Cedar Ridge folk were not given to excessive displays of emotion. But Martha's beaming face and Dr. Harrison's approving nod carried more weight than 1,000 cheers. As they walked back down the aisle together, Clara caught a glimpse of her father standing rigid and alone in the front pew. For a moment their eyes met, and in that brief connection, she saw something she had never expected: fear naked and undisguised in Malcolm Abernathy's gaze. Then they were past him, out into the bright autumn sunshine, where a small gathering waited to offer congratulations and share in the simple wedding feast Martha had prepared. Whatever shadows lurked in her father's eyes would have to wait. Today belonged to hope, to new beginnings, to the promise of a life where Clara could finally discover who she was meant to be. With Nathaniel's strong, steady hand holding hers, she stepped forward into that promise, leaving behind the lonely girl she had been and embracing the woman she was becoming. The healing had begun. The cabin that was to be their home sat in a grove of cottonwoods about a quarter-mile from the Sullivans' main house. It was larger than Nathaniel had described, 3 rooms rather than 2, with a covered porch that faced west toward the mountains. The logs were weathered, but sound, chinked tight against winter winds, and the windows gleamed clean and welcoming in the late afternoon light. "Sarah lived here when they first married," James Sullivan explained as he helped Nathaniel unload their few possessions from the wagon. "Before they built the big house, she insisted on keeping it maintained for guests, or—" He paused, a slight flush coloring his weathered cheeks. "Well, for occasions like this." Clara's heart swelled at the thoughtfulness of their hosts. The Sullivans barely knew her husband, but they'd opened their home and their land to help a young couple start their life together. The interior of the cabin was simple but comfortable, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall of the main room, and a kitchen area equipped with a sturdy wood stove and hand-pumped well water. The bedroom was small but bright, with windows on 2 walls and space enough for the double bed that had been James's wedding gift to them. But it was the touches added by Martha that brought tears to Clara's eyes. Fresh flowers in a blue ceramic vase, clean linens on the bed, and a pot of stew simmering on the stove, with a note promising more substantial provisions would be delivered in the morning. "She didn't have to do all this," Clara whispered, overwhelmed by such kindness from a woman who had already given her so much. "Sarah knows what it's like to start fresh in a new place," Nathaniel said gently. "She and James came out here with nothing but hope and determination 20 years ago. I think she remembers what a difference small kindnesses can make." They spent the evening unpacking Clara's belongings and arranging them throughout the cabin. Her mother's books found homes on the simple wooden shelves that Nathaniel had built beside the fireplace, while Josephine's wedding ring took its place in a small jewelry box on the dresser in their bedroom. The quilt was spread across their marriage bed with reverent care, its intricate pattern of interlocking rings creating a tapestry of blues and greens that seemed to capture the promise of their future together. As darkness fell and they shared their first meal as husband and wife, Clara found herself studying Nathaniel's face in the lamplight. He was even more handsome than she'd first thought, but it was the gentleness in his eyes that truly took her breath away. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, catching her stare. "I'm thinking about how different everything is," she said honestly. "This morning I was Clara Abernathy, spinster daughter of a bitter rancher. Tonight I'm Mrs. Nathaniel Hargrove, sitting in my own kitchen, married to the most wonderful man I've ever known." Nathaniel's smile was soft and pleased. And how does that feel? Terrifying, she admitted with a shaky laugh. Like I might wake up tomorrow and find out it was all a dream. He reached across the small table and covered her hand with his thumb tracing gentle circles across her knuckles. It's not a dream, Clara. This is real. We're real, and tomorrow you'll wake up as Mrs. Hargrove, in your own bed, in your own home, loved and cherished exactly as you deserve to be. The simple declaration made her eyes burn with grateful tears. She'd spent so many years believing she was unworthy of love that accepting Nathaniel's devotion felt like learning to breathe underwater. I don't know how to be a wife, she confessed in a whisper. What if I disappoint you? What if I'm not what you hoped I'd be? Nathaniel stood and moved around the table to kneel beside her chair, taking both her hands in his as he looked up into her face. Listen to me, he said firmly but gently. You could never disappoint me. You're everything I hoped for and more than I ever dared to dream I might find. You're kind and strong and brave, and I count myself the luckiest man alive that you agreed to marry me. His words washed over her like a healing balm, soothing wounds she'd carried for so long, she'd forgotten they were there. I love you, she said suddenly, the words spilling out before she could stop them. I know it's too soon, and maybe I shouldn't say it, but it's not too soon, he interrupted, his voice rough with emotion. And I love you too. I've loved you since that first day when I watched you with the horses and saw how gentle your hands were, how patient your heart was. He stood and drew her to her feet, pulling her into his arms with infinite tenderness. When he kissed her, it was soft and sweet and full of promise, a seal on the vows they'd spoken and the life they were beginning to build together. As they held each other in the lamplight, Clara felt something she'd never experienced before, the absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged, in the arms of a man who loved her not despite her flaws, but because of everything she was. For the first time in 12 years since the day her mother died and took all the warmth out of her world, Clara Hargrove felt truly completely home. Dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of gold and rose as Clara stepped onto the porch of their cabin, a steaming cup of coffee warming her hands against the autumn chill. Mist rose from the creek that wound its way through the Sullivan property, and in the distance she could see the mountains standing sentinel, their peaks already dusted with the first snow of the season. 3 weeks of marriage had settled into a rhythm that still felt miraculous in its simplicity. Each morning, Nathaniel rose before first light to help James with the ranch chores, returning mid-morning for breakfast, with Clara before heading out again until dusk. The hours in between belonged to Clara alone time to establish her own routines to create the home she dreamed of for so long. Martha had helped her start a small kitchen garden before the frost set in, turning over soil for spring planting and showing her where the best sunlight would fall once the days lengthened again. Willow had been installed in a comfortable stall in the Sullivan's barn, her aging joints already responding to the gentle care and better feed she received. And each evening when Nathaniel returned dusty and tired, but always with a smile that seemed reserved just for her, they would share their day over dinner, before settling by the fire talking or reading, or simply sitting in companionable silence. It was more happiness than Clara had ever dared to hope for. And yet, penny for your thoughts, Nathaniel's voice came from behind her, followed by the solid warmth of his arms encircling her waist. He pressed a kiss to the top of her head, breathing in the scent of lavender soap that had become as much a part of his wife as the color of her eyes. Clara leaned back against his chest, allowing herself to absorb his strength. I was just thinking how perfect everything seems, she said. Almost too perfect. And that worries you. His voice carried no judgment, only genuine interest in her thoughts. A little, she admitted. My father always said that when things seem too good to be true, it's because they're about to fall apart. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment, his arms tightening slightly around her. Your father said a lot of things, Clara. Most of them designed to keep you small and afraid. The assessment was so accurate, so free of malice, yet unflinching in its truth, that Clara felt a knot loosen in her chest. I know, it's just hard to unlearn a lifetime of lessons. We've got time, he said simply, all the time in the world, to replace those lessons with better ones. She turned in his arms to face him, studying the features that had become so dear to her in such a short time. There was a steadiness to Nathaniel that anchored her, a quiet certainty that made her own doubts seem less overwhelming. Speaking of time, he continued, James has given me the day off. Said I've earned it with all the work we've put in on that north pasture fence. I thought perhaps you might like to go into town, maybe have lunch at the hotel restaurant. Clara's face lit up. They hadn't been to Cedar Ridge since their wedding, both of them preferring the peaceful isolation of their new home as they adjusted to married life. But she'd been craving female companionship and the chance to show Martha how well she was settling in. I'd love that, she said, already mentally planning what she would wear. I want to stop at the general store too. Martha mentioned she has some new fabric that just came in on the stage. Nathaniel smiled, pleased by her enthusiasm. Then it's settled. We'll make a day of it, the first official outing of Mr. and Mrs. Hargrove. They set off an hour later, riding side by side on the road to town. Nathaniel on his paint gelding and Clara on a gentle mare borrowed from the Sullivans. The day had warmed as the sun climbed higher, and the countryside glowed with the rich amber and crimson hues of late autumn. As they rode, Clara found herself singing softly, a habit that had once been confined to solitary moments in the barn, but now emerged more freely in Nathaniel's encouraging presence. It was a folk song her mother had taught her about a maiden who finds true love where she least expects it. You have a beautiful voice, Nathaniel said when she finished, like a meadowlark at dawn. Clara blushed, still unaccustomed to such direct praise. Mama was the real singer. She performed in theaters back in St. Louis before she married Father. People said she could have been famous if she'd stayed. But she chose love instead, Nathaniel observed. Yes. Clara's expression grew thoughtful. I used to wonder how she could give up something she loved so much, but now I think I understand. Some choices only look like sacrifices from the outside. Nathaniel reached across the space between them to squeeze her hand. Your mother would be proud of the woman you've become, Clara. I'm certain of it. The streets of Cedar Ridge were busy with the usual Saturday traffic as they rode into town. Farmers and ranchers had come in for supplies, their wagons lined up in front of the general store. Children darted between buildings, enjoying the freedom of a day without school, while women gathered in small groups exchanging news and gossip. As Clara and Nathaniel dismounted in front of the hotel, she felt the weight of curious stares. Newlyweds were always a subject of interest in small communities, but their unusual courtship had made them particularly fascinating to the local gossips. Mrs. Hargrove, Martha's voice rang out from the doorway of the general store. She hurried toward them, her round face beaming with delight. And Mr. Hargrove, too. What a wonderful surprise. Clara embraced the older woman warmly. We've come to town for the day. Nathaniel has time off from the ranch, and I wanted to see what new fabrics you've gotten in. Perfect timing. The stage brought in some lovely calico just yesterday, and I've been saving the best pieces for you. Martha linked her arm through Clara's. James is inside, too. He'll be pleased to see you both. The bell above the door jangled as they entered the store. The familiar smells of coffee, leather, and spices enveloped Clara, bringing with them a wave of nostalgia for the many hours she'd spent in this space, finding respite from her father's coldness in Martha's unconditional acceptance. James Sullivan looked up from where he was examining a new saddle, his weathered face breaking into a smile when he saw them. Well, if it isn't our newlyweds, how's married life treating you both? Couldn't be better, Nathaniel replied, shaking the older man's hand. That cabin of yours is the finest home a man could ask for. And how about you, Clara? Martha asked, her eyes sharp with motherly concern. Are you settling in well? Very well. Clara couldn't keep the happiness from her voice. I've started planting the garden for spring, and Willow is thriving in your barn. And your father, James asked, his tone carefully neutral. Have you heard from him since the wedding? The question dimmed Clara's smile. No, she admitted, but I didn't really expect to. Father made his feelings about my marriage quite clear. An awkward silence fell, broken by Martha's determined cheerfulness. Well, his loss is our gain. Now come see these fabrics before Mrs. Peterson claims the best pieces for her daughter's new dress. As the women moved toward the back of the store where bolts of cloth were displayed, Nathaniel and James fell into conversation about ranch business, the price of cattle plans for winter, feed the likelihood of early snow. Clara was examining a bolt of blue calico when the shop bell rang again. She looked up to see Dr. Harrison entering, his medical bag in hand and his expression grave. Martha, he called, do you have any more of that willow bark extract? I'm clean out and the Miller boy's fever is climbing. I believe so, doctor. Martha moved toward the medicinal supplies kept behind the counter. Clara, perhaps you could help. You know where I keep the herbal remedies. Clara joined Martha, sorting through the small bottles and packets of dried herbs. "Here," she said, locating the willow bark, "and you might want to try this too." She held up a small pouch of dried elderflower. "Mama always said it works wonders for children's fevers, especially when mixed with a bit of honey to make it palatable." Dr. Harrison regarded her with interest. "Your mother was Josephine Abernathy, wasn't she? I remember her knowledge of traditional remedies was quite impressive." "She learned from her grandmother," Clara explained, warming to the subject. "She kept journals of all her recipes and treatments. I've been studying them since I was a girl. And putting them to good use from what I hear," the doctor said, nodding approvingly. "James mentioned you saved that old mare of yours when everyone else had given up on her. Said your liniment brought life back to joints that hadn't worked properly in years." Clara blushed at the praise. "It was nothing special, just a mixture of arnica, comfrey, and a few other herbs Mama wrote about." "Nothing special?" Dr. Harrison raised an eyebrow. "Mrs. Hargrove, in my experience, anyone who can heal suffering, whether in man or beast, possesses a very special gift indeed." He accepted the packets Martha had prepared and placed some coins on the counter. "I'd be interested in seeing those journals of your mother's sometime, if you wouldn't mind sharing them." "I'd be honored," Clara replied, surprised and pleased by his interest. As the doctor left, Martha squeezed Clara's arm affectionately. "See, I told you that you had your mother's healing touch. Even Dr. Harrison recognizes it, and he's not a man who's easily impressed." The rest of their visit to town passed pleasantly. They had lunch at the hotel restaurant, a luxury Clara had rarely experienced, and purchased supplies for the coming week. Everywhere they went, people greeted them with varying degrees of curiosity and goodwill, most seeming genuinely pleased to see the shy Abernathy girl so happily settled. It was late afternoon when they finally started the ride home, their horses laden with packages. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains, casting long shadows across the road. "You were right," Clara said as they rode side by side. "It was good to go into town to see people." Nathaniel nodded, though she noticed his expression had grown thoughtful, almost preoccupied since their time at the general store. "James mentioned something interesting while you were looking at fabrics with Martha," he said after a moment. "Apparently there's been a stranger asking questions about your father's ranch." Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cooling air. "What kind of questions?" "The usual at first, how many acres, how many head of cattle, that sort of thing. But then he started asking more personal questions, how long your father's owned the property, whether he has any family besides you, whether he's in good health." "Who was this man?" "James didn't catch his name. Said he was well-dressed, city clothes rather than ranch wear. Spoke with an Eastern accent, possibly St. Louis." St. Louis. The words from her mother's letter flashed into Clara's mind, warnings about men from the city, about old grudges and debts. Could this be the Victor Caldwell her mother had mentioned? "Did James tell him anything?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Nothing of consequence. Said he wasn't one to gossip about his neighbors." Nathaniel studied her face, noting the sudden tension in her features. "Clara, what is it? Do you know something about this?" She hesitated, uncertain how much to reveal. Her mother's letter was such a personal thing, a confidence from beyond the grave. And yet Nathaniel was her husband now, her partner in this new life. "I found a letter," she said finally, "in my mother's journal. She wrote it before she died, meant for me to read when I was old enough to understand." As they rode, Clara told him about the contents of the letter, about her brother's death and its effect on her father, about the gambling debts, and the men from St. Louis, about Victor Caldwell and his connection to her mother's past. Nathaniel listened without interruption, his expression growing increasingly serious. "And you only found this letter the night before our wedding?" he asked when she had finished. Clara nodded. "It explains so much about father, about why he became the way he is. It doesn't excuse how he treated me, but it helps me understand. And these men from St. Louis, your mother believed they were still a threat, even after all these years." "She seemed to think so." Clara shivered, drawing her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "Do you think this stranger could be connected to them?" Nathaniel's face was unreadable in the fading light. "It's possible. The timing is interesting." Something in his tone caught Clara's attention. "What do you mean?" "Just that it's curious a man would show up asking questions so soon after our marriage." He shook his head slightly, as if clearing away unwelcome thoughts. "It's probably nothing. Likely just someone looking to buy property in the area." The territory's growing fast, but his casual dismissal didn't match the watchful alertness in his eyes, and Clara found herself wondering not for the first time what experiences had shaped the man she had married. What sorrows and joys had carved the lines around his eyes and taught him to hide his thoughts behind that calm exterior. As they approached the cabin, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. Nathaniel helped Clara down from her horse, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. "I'll take care of the horses," he said. "Why don't you go inside and get warm?" Clara nodded, suddenly eager for the safety of their small home. As she mounted the porch steps, she glanced back to see Nathaniel standing beside the horses, his gaze scanning the tree line with the focused intensity of a man who expected trouble. The sight sent another chill through her, this one reaching deep into her bones. Whatever secrets lay in her past or in Nathaniel's, it seemed they were not content to remain buried forever. The dream came to Nathaniel in the darkest hour of the night, as it had so many times before. He was in Denver again, moving through rain-slick streets toward the warehouse where the meeting was to take place. Thomas walked beside him, his young face alive with the excitement of the hunt. "This is it, Nate," Thomas was saying, his voice low but vibrant with anticipation. "6 months of work, and we've finally got them cornered. Caldwell won't wiggle out of this one." In the dream, as in reality, Nathaniel tried to urge caution. "We need to wait for backup. These aren't ordinary criminals, Tom. They've got connections, protection from high places." But Thomas was already moving ahead, confident in his badge and his cause. "Justice doesn't wait, partner. Not for corrupt businessmen, not for anyone." Then came the part that always made Nathaniel wake in a cold sweat. The warehouse door opening, the flash of gunfire, Thomas falling with a look of stunned surprise on his face. And Victor Caldwell, stepping from the shadows, elegant as always in his tailored suit, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth as he regarded the fallen marshal. "Such a waste," Caldwell said, his voice cultured and mild, as if commenting on an unfortunate spill at a dinner party. "Young men today have no appreciation for the proper order of things." He turned his attention to Nathaniel, who lay wounded, his blood pooling on the dirty warehouse floor. "You understand, don't you, Marshal Hargrove? Nothing personal in all this. Simply business." The crack of a second gunshot tore Nathaniel from sleep. He sat up with a gulp, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. Then Clara's warm hand touched his shoulder, and reality flooded back the cabin, his marriage, the new life he was trying to build. "Nathaniel," Clara's voice was thick with sleep but tinged with concern. "What is it? What's wrong?" He took a deep breath, willing his racing heart to slow. "Just a dream," he said, covering her hand with his own. "Go back to sleep." But Clara was already sitting up, her eyes adjusting to the darkness enough to see the sheen of sweat on his brow. "Not just any dream," she said quietly. "The same one that woke you 2 nights ago, and the night before that." Nathaniel sighed, knowing he couldn't hide his nocturnal demons from the woman who shared his bed. "It's nothing for you to worry about, Clara. Our old ghosts, that's all." "Tell me," she said, her voice gentle but insistent. "Please, I want to understand." He looked at her in the faint moonlight filtering through the cabin window, her hair loose around her shoulders, her eyes soft with concern, her expression free of judgment or fear. In that moment, he knew he couldn't keep the truth from her any longer. "Before I came to Cedar Ridge," he began, the words feeling rusty in his mouth. "Before I became a ranch hand, I was a U.S. Marshal based in Denver." Clara's eyes widened slightly, but she remained silent, giving him space to continue at his own pace. "I specialized in financial crimes, fraud, corruption, things that crossed territorial lines. My partner Thomas and I had been building a case against a syndicate that was using debt collection as a cover for extortion and land theft across 3 territories." Nathaniel ran a hand through his hair, the memories rising like floodwaters. The leader of this syndicate was a man named Victor Caldwell. Clara's sharp intake of breath told him she'd made the connection to her mother's letter. "The same Caldwell who knew my mother." "Yes." Nathaniel's voice hardened at the name. "A businessman from St. Louis with powerful friends and a reputation for ruthlessness beneath his cultured exterior. His method was always the same: find people in financial distress, often through gambling debts. He'd help create, then use those debts to pressure them into signing over valuable property or business interests." "Like what my father did," Clara murmured. Nathaniel nodded. Thomas and I had been tracking him for months, building a case solid enough that not even his political connections could save him. We were close, so close to bringing him down. He fell silent, the rest of the story lodged in his throat like a physical obstruction. Clara's hand found his in the darkness. "What happened?" she asked softly. We had arranged to meet an informant, someone inside Caldwell's organization who was willing to testify. But when we got there, Nathaniel's voice faltered. "It was a trap. Thomas was killed instantly. I took a bullet in the back, would have died too if a local doctor hadn't found me in time." "Oh, Nathaniel." Clara's arms went around him, offering comfort he wasn't sure he deserved. By the time I recovered enough to pursue the case, Caldwell had disappeared. The syndicate scattered, the witnesses vanished, and my superiors made it clear that some cases weren't worth the political headaches they caused. "So you left the marshals," Clara concluded. "Turned in my badge and headed west, looking for somewhere quiet to start over." His laugh was bitter, lacking any real humor. "Thought I'd left it all behind until I heard about a rancher named Abernathy with gambling debts to a man from St. Louis." Clara pulled back slightly, her expression shifting from sympathy to confusion. "You knew about my father before you came to Cedar Ridge." Nathaniel's silence was answer enough. "That's why you proposed to me," she said, the realization dawning in her voice. "Not because you saw something special in me, but because I was connected to Caldwell through my father. I was your way back into the case." "No." Nathaniel's denial was immediate and fierce. He took her face between his hands, forcing her to meet his gaze, even in the dim light. "That's not true, Clara. Not entirely." "Then what is the truth?" Her voice was remarkably steady, considering the revelations of the past few minutes. Nathaniel took a deep breath, knowing that everything, their marriage, their future, the trust they'd built, hung on his next words. "The truth is that I did come to Cedar Ridge looking for a connection to Caldwell. I'd been tracking rumors for months, trying to pick up his trail. When I heard about your father's debts, I thought it might be the lead I needed." He stroked her cheek gently, willing her to understand. "But the moment I saw you with that old mare in the barn, the way you spoke to her, the gentleness in your hands, something changed. I knew you were special, Clara. I knew you were someone worth knowing, worth protecting." "And at the social," she prompted, "when my father was humiliating me in front of everyone, I'd already been watching you for days by then," Nathaniel admitted, "trying to figure out how to approach you, how to learn more about your father's connection to Caldwell without putting you at risk. But when I heard Malcolm speaking to you that way, something in me just snapped." He smiled ruefully. "The proposal wasn't planned. It was impulsive and probably reckless. But in that moment, all I could think about was stopping him from hurting you anymore." Clara was quiet for a long time, absorbing his words. When she finally spoke, her voice was thoughtful rather than angry. "So our marriage began as part of your quest for justice," she said. "But it became something more." "It became everything," Nathaniel corrected her. "Clara, I won't lie to you. I came to Cedar Ridge with vengeance in my heart. But I stay because of love. Love for you, for the life we're building together, for the person I can be when I'm with you." She studied his face in the moonlight, searching for any hint of deception. "And Caldwell, if he does come to Cedar Ridge, what then?" Nathaniel's expression hardened. "Then I'll protect what's mine. You, our home, our future. I won't let him destroy any of it." "The way he destroyed Thomas," Clara said softly. "Yes." The single word carried the weight of a vow. Clara touched his face, her fingers tracing the lines of tension around his mouth. "We all have ghosts, Nathaniel. Shadows from our past that follow us, no matter how far we run. I'm not angry that you came to Cedar Ridge looking for Caldwell. I'm grateful that you found me instead." The simple acceptance in her words broke something open in Nathaniel's chest, a knot of guilt and shame he'd been carrying for so long it had become part of him. He pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair. "I don't deserve you," he whispered. "Perhaps not," she replied, a smile in her voice. "But you have me nonetheless." As they held each other in the darkness, the dream that had awakened Nathaniel began to recede, its power diminished by the sharing. Outside, an owl called into the night, its haunting cry a reminder that dawn would eventually come, bringing with it the promise of a new day. Whatever dangers lay ahead, whatever shadows from the past still reached for them, they would face them together. Not as marshal and quarry, not as savior and victim, but as husband and wife, each with their own strengths, each with their own reasons to fight for the life they were building. Smoke rose in a thin column from the chimney of the Abernathy ranch house, barely visible against the gray November sky. Clara hesitated at the edge of the property, the basket of healing supplies heavy in her arms, uncertainty making her steps falter. She hadn't seen her father since the wedding 3 weeks earlier. Their parting had been cold final. Malcolm's ultimatum still ringing in her ears as she'd made her choice and walked away from the only home she'd ever known. But the news Martha had brought that morning changed everything. Malcolm had been injured while repairing a fence, a rusty nail tearing a deep gash in his leg. The wound had festered, turning angry and red, and now fever had set in. Dr. Harrison had done what he could, but Martha feared it wouldn't be enough. "He's asking for you," she'd said, her usually cheerful face grave with a concern. "Not in so many words, you know your father, but I can see it in his eyes. He needs you, Clara." So here she stood, torn between the lingering pain of her father's rejection and the pull of familial duty. Behind her, Nathaniel waited on horseback, having insisted on accompanying her despite her protests that she could manage alone. "You don't have to go in with me," she said, turning to look up at him. "I know there's no love lost between you and my father." Nathaniel's expression was unreadable, but his voice was gentle when he spoke. "He's your family, Clara, and that makes him my family too, whether either of us likes it or not." The simple statement steadied her, reminding her that she no longer faced her father's cutting judgments alone. With a nod of determination, she continued up the path to the house, Nathaniel dismounting to follow a few steps behind. The interior of the ranch house was dim and stuffy, the air heavy with the distinctive smells of illness sweat, medicinal herbs, and the faint metallic tang of blood. Martha met them in the main room, relief evident in her tired eyes. "Thank God you're here," she said, embracing Clara briefly. "He's in his bedroom. The fever's been climbing in all morning, and he started talking nonsense, calling for your mother for someone named Thomas." Clara exchanged a quick glance with Nathaniel at the mention of Thomas, the name of his dead partner. Could it be coincidence, or was there some connection they hadn't yet discovered? "Let me see him," Clara said, setting her basket on the kitchen table and removing her shawl. "I've brought some of Mama's remedies that might help bring down the fever." Martha led the way to Malcolm's bedroom, Nathaniel following silently behind. The room was dark, the curtains drawn against the wan daylight. Malcolm lay on the bed, his tall frame diminished somehow by illness, his face flushed with fever, and his breathing labored. Clara approached the bedside, schooling her expression to hide the shock she felt at seeing her father so reduced. She had never known Malcolm Abernathy to be ill. He had always been a force of nature, unyielding as the mountains, and just as permanent in her life. "Father," she said softly, placing a cool hand on his burning forehead. "It's Clara. I've come to help." Malcolm's eyes fluttered open, confusion clouding their usual sharpness. "Josephine," he murmured, the name slurring slightly. "You came back." "No, Father. It's Clara, your daughter." Recognition slowly dawned in his fever-bright eyes. "Clara," he repeated, his voice strengthening slightly. "You shouldn't be here. Not safe." "I'm perfectly safe," she assured him, Roddy assessing his condition with the practiced eye she developed caring for sick animals. "Martha says you have injured your leg. I need to look at it." Without waiting for permission, she gently pulled back the blanket to reveal Malcolm's right leg bandaged from knee to ankle. The dressing was soaked through in places with a yellowish discharge that spoke of infection. "I need fresh water," she said to Martha, "and clean cloths, and the herbs from my basket, echinacea yarrow, and the honey mixture I prepared." As Martha hurried to fetch the requested items, Clara carefully began unwrapping the bandage. The wound beneath was angry and inflamed, the edges puffy and discolored. Dr. Harrison had cleaned it as best he could, but the infection had clearly taken hold. "This is going to hurt," she warned her father, "but I need to clean it properly before I can apply the poultice." Malcolm nodded weakly past the point of pride or protest. As Clara worked gently but thoroughly cleaning the wound, Nathaniel positioned himself at the head of the bed, his steady hands supporting Malcolm's shoulders, when the pain became too great to bear silently. It was strange, Clara thought, to see these two men, one who had hurt her for so long, one who had saved her, united in this moment of vulnerability and care. Stranger still to realize that she no longer feared her father's judgment or craved his approval. She was here not as his dutiful daughter seeking love that had always been withheld, but as a healer offering comfort to someone in pain. When the wound was clean, Clara applied a poultice of herbs mixed with honey, wrapping it in fresh bandages with practiced efficiency. Then she prepared a tea of willowbark, echinacea, and elderberry, supporting Malcolm's head as she helped him drink. "This will help with the fever and the pain," she explained. "You need to drink as much as you can and rest." Malcolm complied without argument, his usual stubborn independence subdued by illness. When he had drained the cup, Clara eased him back against the pillows, smoothing the blanket over his chest. "You should sleep now," she said. "I'll stay until the fever breaks." Malcolm's hand shot out with surprising strength, gripping her wrist. "No," he said urgently. "You need to go, both of you." His gaze shifted to include Nathaniel. "Not safe here." "Father, you're ill," Clara said soothingly. "The fever is making you confused." "Not confused," Malcolm insisted, his eyes suddenly clear and focused. "They're coming. Caldwell's men, looking for the deed." Clara felt Nathaniel stiffen beside her. "What deed, Mr. Abernathy?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. Malcolm's eyes darted around the room as if checking for eavesdroppers. "Land deed," he whispered. "Railroad coming through. Valuable land." His gaze locked on Clara's face. "Your mother's land. In her name. Hidden." The revelation hit Clara like a physical blow. Land in her mother's name, hidden from Caldwell and his men. If it was true, it explains so much: her father's desperate gambling, his financial troubles, his increasingly erratic behavior as Clara's wedding approached. "Where is it, Father?" she asked urgently. "Where is the deed hidden?" But Malcolm's brief moment of lucidity was fading, his eyes growing unfocused once more. "Josephine knows," he murmured, slipping back into delirium. "She always knows where the music hides." Clara looked up at Nathaniel, who was watching Malcolm with an intensity that spoke of more than mere concern for a sick man. "Caldwell," he said quietly. "If Malcolm's telling the truth, it explains why a stranger's been asking questions in town. He's finally tracked down the land he's been searching for all these years." "But what does it have to do with my mother?" Clara asked, confusion evident in her voice. "And what did he mean about music hiding?" Before Nathaniel could respond, the sound of approaching horses reached them through the bedroom window. Martha, who had been standing quietly in the doorway, moved to peek through the curtains. "Durst coming," she reported, her voice tense. 3 men dressed like city folk. One of them matches the description of that stranger who's been asking questions. Nathaniel's expression hardened. "Caldwell," he said grimly. "He's found us." Fear clutched at Clara's heart, not for herself, but for the 3 people in this room with her. Her sick father, the woman who had been like a mother to her, and the husband who had already lost so much to Victor Caldwell's ruthlessness. "What do we do?" she asked, rising to her feet with a composure that surprised even her. Nathaniel assessed the situation rapidly, his marshal's training evident in the focused efficiency of his thoughts. "Martha, is there a back way out of the house?" Martha nodded. "Through the kitchen. There's a door leads straight to the barn." "Good. Take Clara and get to your wagon. Head for town, straight to the sheriff's office." "No," Clara said firmly, unexpected steel in her voice. "I'm not leaving my father, and I'm not leaving you to face Caldwell alone." "Clara," Nathaniel began, but she cut him off. "No, Nathaniel. You told me once that I was strong, that I had a kind of quiet courage. Let me prove you right." She turned to Martha. "You should go, though. There's no need for you to be involved in this." Martha's round face set in stubborn lines. "James Sullivan didn't marry a coward girl. I'm staying right here with you." The sound of boots on the parched steps interrupted their conversation. Nathaniel moved to the bedroom door, checking that his pistol was secure in its holster. "Stay with your father," he told Clara. "I'll try to reason with them, convince them to leave peacefully." "And if they won't?" Clara asked, already knowing the answer. Nathaniel's eyes met hers, love and determination mingling in their gray depths. "Then I'll do whatever it takes to protect my family." He slipped from the room, closing the door behind him. Clara heard his steady footsteps crossing to the front door, heard the creak of hinges as he opened it to face whatever waited on the other side. In the bed, Malcolm stirred, his fever-bright eyes opening once more. "Clara," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "The music box. Your mother's music box. Look inside." Understanding dawned like sunrise after the longest night. The small rosewood box that had been her mother's prized possession, now sitting on Clara's dresser in the cabin she shared with Nathaniel. A box that played a single haunting melody When opened, the same melody Josephine had sung to Clara as a lullaby. "The deed is in the music box," she asked, leaning close to hear her father's fading words. Malcolm nodded weakly. "Hidden in the mechanism. Josephine's land. Rightfully yours." His hand found hers, squeezing with surprising strength. "I tried to protect it for you, failed. Always failing you." The simple admission, delivered without excuses or justifications, touched Clara more deeply than any elaborate apology could have. In this moment of extremity, with fever stripping away his defenses, Malcolm Abernathy had finally shown his daughter a glimpse of the man he might have been, the father he had wanted to be, before grief and bitterness twisted him into someone unrecognizable. "You haven't failed," she said softly, returning the pressure of his hand. "Not yet, and neither have I." From the main room came the sound of voices, Nathaniel's deep and steady, another man's cultured and smooth as polished stone. Though she couldn't make out the words, Clara could feel the tension vibrating through the house like heat from a stove. Martha moved to stand beside her, a hand on her shoulder offering silent support. Together they waited as the conversation in the other room grew more heated, as boots scraped on floorboards and voices rose in anger. And then a sound that tore through the tension like lightning through storm clouds, the unmistakable metallic click of a pistol being cocked. Clara rose to her feet, her decision made in that instant of crystal clarity. Her place was beside her husband, facing whatever came together. No more hiding, no more allowing others to define her worth or dictate her choices. "Stay with him," she told Martha, gesturing toward her father. "Keep applying cool cloths to his forehead. I'll be back." Before Martha could protest, Clara slipped from the bedroom, closing the door quietly behind her. In the main room, three men stood facing Nathaniel, who had positioned himself between them and the bedroom door. The one in the center, tall, elegant, with silver threading his dark hair and cold eyes that assessed everything in terms of monetary value, could only be Victor Caldwell. The two men flanking him were clearly hired muscle, their expressions as hard as their calloused hands. "Ah," Caldwell said, noticing Clara's entrance. "And here she is, Malcolm's daughter. The final piece of our little puzzle." His smile never reached his eyes. "Mrs. Hargrove, I presume, or do you prefer Abernathy?" Clara lifted her chin, meeting his gaze without flinching. "Hargrove," she said clearly. "My name is Clara Hargrove." "Clara," Nathaniel warned, not taking his eyes off the three men, "go back to your father." "No." The word was simple but unyielding. She moved to stand beside her husband, her presence a declaration that whatever came next, they would face it as equals, as partners, as one. Caldwell watched the exchange with the detached interest of a scientist observing specimens under glass. "How touching," he remarked. "Young love in full bloom." His attention shifted back to Nathaniel. "Though I must say, Marshal Hargrove, I'm surprised by your choice of bride. I wouldn't have thought Malcolm Abernathy's daughter would be to your taste." "Former Marshal," Nathaniel corrected, his voice level, despite the tension Clara could feel in his body. "And my wife is none of your concern, Caldwell." "Oh, but she is." Caldwell's smile widened, showing teeth too perfect to be natural. "You see, Mrs. Hargrove holds the key to something I've been seeking for a very long time. Something that rightfully belongs to me." "Nothing here belongs to you," Clara said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. "Not the ranch, not the land, and certainly not anything of my mother's." At the mention of Josephine, something flickered across Caldwell's face, a brief shadow of genuine emotion breaking through the calculated facade. "Your mother," he said softly, "was a remarkable woman, talented, beautiful, and utterly stubborn in her refusal to see where her best interests lay. She saw clearly enough to choose my father over you." Clara replied, understanding dawning as she spoke. This wasn't just about land or money or old gambling debts. This was about rejection, about a man whose pride had been wounded by a woman who preferred a simple rancher to all his wealth and sophistication. Caldwell's eyes hardened. "She chose poorly, and that choice has led us all to this rather unpleasant moment." He gestured to his men. "Search the house. Find the deed." "No," Nathaniel said, his hand moving to rest on his holstered pistol. "You have no authority here, Caldwell. No right to enter this house or search for anything." "I have every right," Caldwell countered smoothly. "Malcolm Abernathy owes me a considerable sum of money he borrowed with this property as collateral. The fact that he concealed certain assets during those transactions constitutes fraud, which gives me the legal right to reclaim what is mine." The land was never his to offer as collateral. Clara said, the pieces finally fitting together in her mind. It belonged to my mother and now to me. That's why you've been searching for the deed all these years, because without it, you have no claim to the property. Caldwell's expression confirmed her deduction. Very good, Mrs. Hargrove. It seems you've inherited your mother's intelligence, along with her unfortunate taste in men. He turned to his companions. Gentlemen, please begin your search, and do be thorough. We've waited a long time for this moment. As the men moved to obey, Nathaniel's pistol cleared its holster with practiced speed. Stop right there, he commanded, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of his former position. Clara, go to the bedroom. Get Martha and your father out through the back. Now. Clara hesitated, torn between obeying her husband and standing her ground against the men who had haunted her family for so long. Clara, Nathaniel said again, his eyes never leaving Caldwell's face. Please. It was the please that decided her, not a command, but a request born of love, rather than the need to control. With a nod, she turned and hurried back to the bedroom, where Martha was still tending to Malcolm's fever. We need to leave, Clara said urgently. Nathaniel's holding them off, but we don't have much time. Can you help me get father to the wagon? Martha's practical nature asserted itself immediately. There's a stretcher in the barn, one we use for moving injured animals. We can use that. Together they managed to wrap Malcolm in blankets and maneuver him through the kitchen to the back door. As they emerged into the gray November afternoon, a gunshot rang out from inside the house. Clara froze, her heart seizing in her chest. Nathaniel, she whispered. Go, Martha urged, taking charge of Malcolm. I'll get your father to the wagon. You help your husband. Without hesitation, Clara turned and ran back into the house, fear lending speed to her steps. In the main room, she found Nathaniel still standing, his pistol trained on Caldwell, who was clutching his arm where a dark stain was spreading across his expensive coat. The two henchmen had backed away, clearly reassessing the situation in light of their employer's injury. Next one won't be a warning, Nathaniel was saying, his voice deadly calm. Leave now while you still can. Caldwell's face was a mask of fury, his cultured veneer cracking to reveal the ruthless predator beneath. This isn't over, Hargrove, he spat. The deed exists, and I will find it. And when I do, I'll take great pleasure in watching you and your wife lose everything you have built. The only thing I'm going to leave you, Nathaniel replied, is the time it takes to escort you off this property. Now move. As the three men backed toward the door, Caldwell's gaze fell on Clara standing in the doorway to the kitchen. A slow, calculating smile spread across his face. Mrs. Hargrove, perhaps you'd like to tell your husband about the music box, the one your mother kept so carefully hidden. I wonder what secrets it might contain. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. How could Caldwell know about the music box unless... He's been watching us, she realized aloud. Watching the cabin, following our movements. Very perceptive, Caldwell agreed. You see, Marshall, I've learned the value of patience over the years. Why force a confrontation when simple observation will yield the same results with far less risk? Nathaniel's expression remained impassive, but Clara could see the tension in his jaw, the slight narrowing of his eyes that betrayed his concern. Goodbye, Mr. Caldwell, he said evenly. I won't tell you again to leave. With a final venomous glare, Caldwell allowed his men to usher him from the house. Through the window, Clara watched as they mounted their horses and rode away, their figures growing smaller against the vast landscape. Only when they had disappeared from sight did Nathaniel lower his pistol, the rigid control he'd maintained finally giving way to visible relief. Are you all right? Clara asked, moving to his side. He nodded, holstering his weapon with hands that weren't quite steady. Fine, just a disagreement about property rights. His attempt at humor fell flat, undermined by the gravity of the situation. Your father and Martha. On their way to the wagon. We need to get him to our cabin where I can treat him properly. Clara touched Nathaniel's arm, feeling the tension still thrumming through him. And we need to check the music box. Understanding dawned in Nathaniel's eyes. So there really is a deed hidden there. According to father, yes. Land that belonged to my mother, valuable land that Caldwell has been searching for all these years. She shook her head, still processing the implications. But how did he know about the music box? I've never mentioned it to anyone. He's been watching us, Nathaniel said grimly. Probably had someone in town gathering information about your family for weeks, maybe months. He rubbed a hand across his face, the gesture betraying his exhaustion. We need to move quickly. Get your father settled at our place, then find that deed before Caldwell decides to take more direct action. Clara nodded, a strange calm settling over her despite the danger they faced. For years, she had lived in the shadow of her father's bitterness, believing herself unworthy of love or respect. Now she stood beside a man who had risked his life to protect her, facing a threat that would have once seemed overwhelming, but now felt merely like one more challenge to overcome together. He won't win, she said, her voice quiet but determined. Whatever happens, whatever Caldwell tries, he won't take what's ours. Nathaniel looked at her with a mixture of pride and concern. No, he agreed, he won't. But Clara, this isn't just about land or money anymore. Caldwell's a dangerous man when crossed, and now he's wounded physically and in his pride. He'll come after us with everything he has. Then we'll be ready, Clara replied simply. Together. As they left the house to join Martha and Malcolm, the first snowflakes of winter began to fall, dusting the landscape in a fine white powder that transformed the familiar into something new and unexplored. Like their marriage, Clara thought, begun in haste and complicated by secrets, yet somehow growing into something strong and true despite its unconventional foundations. Whatever dangers lay ahead, whatever revelations still waited to be uncovered, she would face them with Nathaniel at her side. Not as the timid, uncertain girl she had been, but as the woman she was becoming, a woman with the courage to stand her ground, the strength to protect those she loved, and the wisdom to recognize that the most powerful healing came not from herbs or poultices, but from the simple act of being truly seen and valued for exactly who she was. Snow fell steadily through the afternoon, blanketing the land in silent white as Clara tended to her father in the small bedroom of the cabin. They had managed to transport Malcolm from the ranch with Martha's help, making the journey slowly to avoid jostling his fevered body. Now he lay on the narrow bed that had been hastily prepared, his breathing labored and his skin burning with infection. Nathaniel had ridden to town to fetch Dr. Harrison, leaving Clara to battle the fever with her mother's remedies and her own determined care. Martha had reluctantly returned to her home after extracting a promise that Clara would send for her if the situation worsened. You shouldn't be alone, Martha had insisted, her eyes darting to Malcolm's unconscious form. Not with him so ill and Caldwell still out there somewhere. I'll be fine until Nathaniel returns, Clara had assured her with more confidence than she truly felt. The storm will keep Caldwell away at least for tonight. Now as dusk deepened into night and the wind moaned around the cabin's sturdy walls, Clara changed the poultice on her father's wound and bathed his fevered brow with cool water. The infection had taken firm hold, spreading angry red tendrils up his calf toward his knee. Fight, father, she murmured, as she worked, her voice barely audible above the crackling fire. Whatever else lies between us, I'm not ready to lose you yet. Malcolm stirred at the sound of her voice, his eyes opening to reveal a momentary clarity amidst the fever's haze. Clara, he rasped, his hand reaching weakly for hers. The music box. You must find it before Caldwell. I will, she promised, taking his hand between both of hers. But first I need to break your fever. Try to rest. He shook his head, agitation making his breathing more labored. No time. Caldwell won't wait. The land, it's valuable. Railroad survey. Clara frowned, piecing together his fragmented words. A railroad is coming through the property. Is that why Caldwell wants it so badly? Malcolm nodded weakly. Junction point. Whoever owns that land controls access to the whole valley. His eyes found hers surprisingly lucid despite the fever. Your mother knew. That's why she put it in her name alone. To protect it from my weaknesses. The admission clearly cost him both physically and emotionally. Clara felt an unexpected surge of compassion for this proud, difficult man who had finally acknowledged his own failings. Rest now, she said gently. We'll talk more when you're stronger. Malcolm's eyes were already closing, exhaustion pulling him back into unconsciousness. Clara tucked the blankets around him and rose, her muscles protesting after hours of tending to her father's needs. The main room of the cabin was warm and bright with firelight. Outside, the storm had intensified, snow swirling in the darkness like restless spirits. Clara crossed to the small dresser where she kept her personal belongings and lifted the lid of her mother's music box. It was a beautiful piece crafted from rosewood with delicate inlaid flowers around the edges. When opened, a small cylinder inside rotated its metal pins, plucking at a steel comb to produce the haunting melody that had been the soundtrack to Clara's earliest memories. She let the tune play through once its familiar notes stirring emotions that felt both comforting and painful. Then carefully she turned the box over and examined its underside. Nothing seemed unusual or out of place. Frowning, Clara set the bone in the table and studied it more closely. Her father had said the deed was hidden in the mechanism. She needed to access the interior without damaging the delicate workings. After several minutes of careful examination, she noticed a small, almost invisible seam along the back edge of the box. Pressing gently with her fingernail, she felt a slight give, then heard a soft click as a hidden panel popped open. Inside the shallow compartment lay a folded document, yellowed with age but perfectly preserved. With trembling fingers, Clara withdrew it and unfolded it on the table. The land deed was made out to Josephine Marie Abernathy, granting her sole ownership of 40 acres adjoining the northern boundary of the Abernathy Ranch. The description mentioned a creek and a natural pass through the foothills, features Clara recognized from childhood explorations with her mother. What she hadn't known was the significance of that particular piece of land. If Malcolm was right, if a railroad was planning to build through that pass, the property would indeed be extraordinarily valuable, a controlling interest in the economic future of the entire region. No wonder Caldwell had pursued it so relentlessly. No wonder her father had gambled so desperately trying to maintain control of the adjacent ranch land. It all made a terrible kind of sense. A sound at the door made Clara start her hand, instinctively gathering the deed and pressing it to her chest. But it was only Nathaniel stamping snow from his boots as he entered with Dr. Harrison close behind. "Thank God," she breathed, relief flooding through her. "I was beginning to worry the storm had caught you." "Nearly did," Nathaniel replied, helping the older doctor remove his snow-covered coat. Another hour in the pass would have been impassable. Dr. Harrison, a spare man in his 60s with keen eyes and efficient movements, wasted no time on pleasantries. "Where's the patient?" he asked, already opening his medical bag. "This way." Clara led him to the bedroom, briefly explaining the treatments she'd administered and the progression of Malcolm's symptoms. The doctor examined the wound carefully, his expression grave but not hopeless. "Infection's bad, but not yet in the blood," he pronounced finally. "You've done well with the poultices, Mrs. Hargrove. Another day without treatment, and we might have been discussing amputation." Clara paled at the thought, but maintained her composure. "What can we do now?" "Continue with the herbal treatments. They're helping control the spread. I've brought some stronger medicine as well." He removed a small bottle from his bag. "Laudanum for the pain, and this powder mixed with honey for the infection. Give him both every 4 hours and keep the wound clean and dressed." He straightened, regarding Clara with professional assessment. "You have your mother's touch for healing. Josephine would be proud to see how you've applied her teachings." The unexpected praise from the normally reserved doctor touched Clara deeply. "Thank you," she said simply. "The fever's the greatest danger now, Doctor," Harrison continued. "If it doesn't break by morning, we may need to consider more dramatic measures." "I'll stay with him through the night," Clara promised. The doctor nodded approvingly. "I'd expected nothing less. Now, if there's somewhere an old man might rest for a few hours, I'll take another look at our patient before attempting the journey back to town." "Of course." Clara led him back to the main room where Nathaniel had prepared coffee and a simple meal of bread and stew. "You can take our bed, Doctor. I'll be sitting with Father anyway." As Dr. Harrison ate, Clara showed Nathaniel the deed she'd discovered in the music box. He studied it carefully, his expression growing increasingly serious. "This confirms everything," he said quietly, so the doctor wouldn't overhear. 40 acres including Willow Pass, exactly where the Western Union Railroad has been surveying for a junction point. "How do you know about the railroad plans?" Clara asked. A shadow crossed Nathaniel's face. "It was part of our investigation in Denver. Caldwell and his associates had been buying up land along proposed routes using inside information from bribed officials. Thomas and I were close to proving the connection when—" He left the sentence unfinished, but Clara understood. When Thomas had been killed and Nathaniel wounded, their investigation had died with them, allowing Caldwell to continue his land schemes unhindered. "But why was my mother involved?" Clara wondered. "How did she come to own this particular piece of land?" "That," said Dr. Harrison, who had apparently been listening despite their lowered voices, "is a story worth hearing." Clara and Nathaniel turned to the older man in surprise. He regarded them steadily over the rim of his coffee cup, his eyes reflecting the firelight. I delivered you into this world, Clara, he said, and I attended your mother during her final illness. I was also there the night your brother was born and died. There are things about your family that perhaps you should know now that Caldwell has resurfaced. Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm raging outside. What things? Dr. Harrison set down his cup and leaned forward in his manner, that of a man preparing to unburden himself of a long-carried weight. Your mother came to Cedar Ridge already owning that 40 acres, he began. It was a gift from her grandfather, who had been one of the original settlers in this territory. She met your father when he was working as a ranch hand for the Sullivans. This was before James inherited the place from his father. This was new information to Clara. She had always assumed her parents had met after Malcolm established his own ranch. They fell in love quickly, the doctor continued. Malcolm was different, than ambitious, hardworking, full of dreams for the future. Josephine saw something in him that many missed, a depth of feeling beneath the practical exterior. He paused, gathering his thoughts. But there was a complication. Victor Caldwell had followed Josephine from St. Louis, determined to persuade her to return with him. He'd been courting her there, offering a life of comfort and culture that must have been tempting to a young woman with Josephine's talents. But she chose my father instead, Clara said. Dr. Harrison nodded. She did, and Caldwell never forgave either of them for what he saw as a humiliating rejection. He returned to St. Louis, but not before vowing that someday he would take everything Malcolm valued, just as Malcolm had taken Josephine from him. An oath he spent 20 years trying to fulfill, Nathaniel observed grimly. Indeed. The doctor's expression was somber. When railroad surveyors began appearing in the territory about 15 years ago, Josephine realized the potential value of her land. She also recognized that Caldwell, with his business connections, would eventually learn of it as well. So she kept the deed hidden, Clara concluded, and made sure the land remained solely in her name, protected from father's gambling debts. And from Caldwell's legal maneuverings, the doctor agreed. Josephine was a remarkable woman, not just for her voice or her healing knowledge, but for her foresight. She knew that someday this land might be all that stood between her family and destitution. Clara thought of the mother she had lost so young, the woman who had filled their home with music and laughter, who had taught her about healing plants and gentle strength. She had never known this other side of Josephine, the strategist, the protector planning for contingencies even from beyond the grave. What about my brother? She asked quietly. How does he fit into all this? Dr. Harrison's face softened with old sorrow. Thomas Malcolm Abernathy lived only 3 days. His lungs never fully developed, though we did everything possible to save him. He shook his head, the memory still painful after all these years. Your father had such hopes built around that boy, dreams of expanding the ranch, creating a legacy to pass down through generations of Abernathy men. And when Thomas died, those dreams died with him, Clara said, understanding dawning like a cold sunrise. That's when father started gambling, wasn't it? Trying to fill the emptiness with risk and excitement. Grief affects people in different ways, the doctor said gently. Some turn inward, some lash out, and some seek oblivion, however they can find it. Malcolm chose cards and whiskey, and by the time he realized how deep the hole had become, Caldwell was there offering loans with terms designed to ensure failure. Nathaniel had been listening intently, fitting this new information into his understanding of the case. But Malcolm never told Caldwell about Josephine's land, he said. Even when the debts mounted and the threats began, he kept that secret. He protected the one thing he had left of her. Clara realized a new perspective on her father taking shape in her mind. Not out of love for Ma, but out of love for her memory. Don't underestimate your father's feelings for you, Clara, Dr. Harrison said. Malcolm may not show affection easily, but in his own flawed way, he has always tried to protect you first by keeping you isolated from Caldwell's attention, and then by driving you away when he realized the danger was closing in. The thought was so at odds with Clara's lifetime of experience that she found it difficult to accept. Yet it explains so much her father's increasing bitterness as she grew older and more like her mother, his desperate opposition to her marriage, his insistence that she leave the ranch even as he lay burning with fever. He was trying to keep me safe, she whispered, the realization both painful and healing. All these years, in his own broken way, he was trying to protect me. Dr. Harrison nodded. Love doesn't always wear a kind face, Clara. Sometimes, especially when twisted by grief and guilt, It can look remarkably like cruelty. The three of them sat in silence for a moment, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the howling of the wind outside. Then from the bedroom came a sudden cry of distress. Clara was on her feet instantly, rushing to her father's side with Dr. Harrison close behind. Malcolm was thrashing against the blankets, his face flushed scarlet with fever and his eyes wide but unseeing. "He's delirious," the doctor said, helping Clara restrain her father's flailing arms. "The fever's spiking. We need to cool him down immediately." What followed was a desperate battle against the infection raging through Malcolm's body. Clara and the doctor worked side by side, applying cold compresses, administering medicines, and speaking soothingly to the disoriented man, who alternated between combative struggles and periods of eerie stillness. Nathaniel kept the fire burning and brought fresh snow to melt for compresses, his quiet efficiency allowing Clara and the doctor to focus entirely on their patient. As the night deepened, Malcolm's fever seemed to reach a crescendo. His breathing became shallow and rapid, his skin hot and dry to the touch. In his delirium, he called out for Josephine, for the baby son he had lost, and occasionally with heart-wrenching clarity for Clara herself. "Stay with him," Dr. Harrison instructed Clara around midnight, his lined face showing the strain of the prolonged effort. "Talk to him." Sometimes even in delirium, patients can find their way back by following a familiar voice. Clara nodded, taking her father's hand between both of hers as the doctor stepped away to consult with Nathaniel. Malcolm's fingers were unnaturally hot, the skin papery and dry from dehydration despite their efforts to make him drink. "Father," she said softly, leaning close to his ear, "it's Clara. I need you to listen to me." For a moment there was no response. Then Malcolm's restless movements stilled slightly, as if some part of him recognized her voice. "I found the deed," she continued. "I understand now why you kept it secret all these years, why you tried to protect Mother's land." She swallowed against the tightness in her throat. "I understand why you pushed me away too. You were trying to keep me safe from Caldwell, weren't you?" Malcolm's eyelids fluttered, though whether in response to her words or simply due to the fever, Clara couldn't tell. "But you don't need to fight alone anymore," she went on, her voice strengthening. "I'm not that frightened little girl who needed protection. I'm stronger than you know, stronger than I knew myself." She squeezed his hand gently. "And I'm not going to let Caldwell win. Not now, not ever." As she spoke, something extraordinary happened. Almost imperceptibly at first, then with gathering momentum, a melody rose from her throat, the same haunting tune from her mother's music box, but transformed by Clara's voice into something living and powerful. She hadn't planned to sing. The music seemed to well up from some deep place inside her, bypassing conscious thought, to emerge as pure expression of everything she couldn't put into words: grief and hope, forgiveness and determination, the complicated love between parent and child that persists even through years of hurt. Clara sang as she had never sung before, her clear soprano filling the small cabin with a sound so beautiful that Dr. Harrison and Nathaniel froze in their conversation, turning to watch in wonder as this unexpected gift unfolded before them. And Malcolm, burning with fever, fighting for his life against infection and exhaustion, grew still beneath her hands. His breathing, which had been rapid and shallow, gradually deepened and slowed. The tension in his face eased the lines of pain, softening, as if the music itself were a healing balm. Clara sang until her voice began to falter, until the melody had wound its way through her father's fevered dreams and into whatever quiet place of peace still existed within him. When she finally fell silent, the room seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Then Malcolm sighed deeply, a sound of profound release, and Clara felt a subtle change beneath her hands. The unnatural heat of his skin had lessened, not dramatically but noticeably. His breathing had steadied into the more natural rhythm of healing sleep. "The fever's breaking, Doctor," Harrison said quietly, moving forward to place a professional hand on Malcolm's forehead. "I've never seen anything quite like it." He looked at Clara with newfound respect. "Your mother had healing in her hands, but you, Clara, you have healing in your voice." Clara herself felt dazed, as if she had just returned from a journey to some distant place. The experience of singing for her father had been so intense, so completely absorbing, that she felt drained yet strangely energized, like land after a cleansing storm. "I didn't know I could do that," she whispered. "Sometimes our greatest gifts reveal themselves only when most needed," the doctor replied. "Josephine would be proud." Nathaniel moved to stand beside Clara, his hand warm and steady on her shoulder. "You should rest," he said gently. "You've been tending to him for hours without a break." Clara shook her head, though her body ached with fatigue. "I want to stay with him a little longer, to make sure the fever doesn't return." "At least sit," Nathaniel insisted, bringing a chair to the bedside. "I'll bring you some tea." Too exhausted to argue, Clara sank into the chair, her eyes never leaving her father's face. For the first time since she could remember, Malcolm Abernathy looked at peace, the habitual lines of bitterness and disappointment smoothed away by healing sleep. As dawn approached, bringing with it the pale light of a snow-covered world, Clara finally allowed herself to doze, her head pillowed on her arms at the edge of her father's bed. She dreamed of her mother singing in a sunlit garden, of a small boy with Malcolm's eyes playing in the grass, of a future where old wounds had finally healed. 3 days passed before Malcolm was strong enough to sit up and take solid food. The infection had retreated, though Dr. Harrison cautioned that complete recovery would take weeks, not days. The storm had finally blown itself out, leaving behind a transformed landscape of pristine white, broken only by the occasional track of deer or rabbit. Clara had barely left her father's side during those critical days, sleeping in snatches and eating only when Nathaniel insisted. Now, as Malcolm's strength gradually returned, she found herself confronting the reality of their situation. Caldwell had not reappeared since the confrontation at the ranch, but his absence brought little comfort. Both Nathaniel and Dr. Harrison believed he was merely regrouping, perhaps seeking legal means to claim the land now that direct intimidation had failed. "He'll try to challenge the deed," Nathaniel explained as they sat at the kitchen table studying the document that had caused so much trouble. "He'll claim that Malcolm used the property as collateral for loans, that Josephine's ownership was merely a technicality." "But that's not true," Claire protested. "The land was hers alone, inherited from her grandfather. Father never had any legal claim to it." "Truth and law aren't always the same thing," Dr. Harrison said grimly, "especially in territorial courts where judges can be influenced by men with Caldwell's connections." Malcolm, who had insisted on being moved to a chair by the fire despite his weakness, spoke up for the first time. "Josephine kept records," he said, his voice still raspy from fever. "Letters from her grandfather, the original grant papers, everything proving her sole ownership." "Where are these records?" Nathaniel asked sharply. "Safe deposit box. Bank in Denver." Malcolm's words came slowly, each one an effort. "Key in my desk. Ranch house." Clara and Nathaniel exchanged looks. The ranch house where Caldwell had last been seen, where he might even now be searching for the very evidence they needed. "I'll go," Nathaniel said, already rising from his chair. "Dr. Harrison can stay with you and Malcolm." "No," Clara's response was immediate and firm. "We go together. Father is stable now, and Martha can look after him for a few hours." "Clara, it's too dangerous. If Caldwell is still there, then two of us have a better chance than one," she countered. "Besides, I know where Father keeps his keys. You'd waste time searching." Nathaniel looked as if he wanted to argue further, but something in Clara's expression stopped him. This was not the timid, uncertain woman he had first met, the one who deferred to others' judgments and doubted her own worth. This was someone stronger, someone who had found her voice in more ways than one. "All right," he conceded. "But we go prepared, and at the first sign of trouble we leave." "Agreed." Clara nodded, already mentally listing what they would need for the journey. The snow would make travel slow but not impossible, and the clear skies promised at least temporary respite from winter's fury. They set out an hour later after settling Malcolm comfortably and leaving detailed instructions with Martha, who had arrived bearing food and her usual practical good sense. The temperature had risen slightly, making the snow heavy and wet, but their horses managed the familiar trail without undue difficulty. As they approached the Abernathy Ranch, Clara felt a strange mixture of emotions. This place had been her home for 24 years, the scene of both her deepest unhappiness and her most cherished memories of her mother. Now it felt like a chapter closing a part of her life that had served its purpose and could finally be set aside. The ranch house stood silent, an apparently deserted smoke no longer rising from the chimney, and no tracks marring the pristine snow around it. Nathaniel approached cautiously, nonetheless, his hand resting on his holstered pistol as he circled the building to check for signs of occupation. "Seems empty," he reported, returning to where Clara waited with the horses. "But that doesn't mean Caldwell hasn't been here since the storm broke." They entered together, the familiar smells of the house wood-smoked coffee, the faint mustiness of a place closed up for days washing over Clara with the force of memory. Everything looked exactly as they had left it after the confrontation with Caldwell, yet something felt different, as if the house itself had exhaled and settled in their absence. "Father's study is this way," Clara said, leading Nathaniel down the short hallway to the small room where Malcolm had kept his account books and personal papers. The study was tidy but clearly well used, with a desk positioned to catch the morning light and shelves filled with practical manuals on ranching, animal husbandry, and territorial law. Clara went directly to the desk, opening the top drawer to reveal a small wooden box containing several keys. "He said it was in the Denver City Bank," she murmured, examining each key. "This must be it." She held up a small brass key with the bank's name stamped into its head. "We should take all of them," Nathaniel suggested, "and any papers that might help establish your mother's claim to the land." As they gathered what they needed, a sound from outside made them both freeze, the unmistakable approach of horses, multiple riders, by the sound of it coming fast through the snow. Nathaniel moved to the window, peering cautiously through the curtains. "Caldwell," he confirmed grimly, "and at least 4 men with him." Clara's heart raced, but her mind remained clear. "The back door," she said, already gathering the keys and papers into a small bundle. "Through the kitchen like before." They moved swiftly and silently, years of ranch work having taught Clara how to tread lightly even on the creaking floorboards of the old house. The kitchen door opened onto a path that led directly to the barn, partially sheltered from view by a stand of cottonwoods. But as they reached the door, Clara paused, a sudden realization stopping her mid-step. "The music box," she said. "I left it at the cabin." "We have the deed," Nathaniel reminded her. "That's what matters." Clara shook her head. "Not just the deed. Mother's journals, they're hidden in a compartment in the bottom of the box, just like the deed was. The original land grant could be there too." Before Nathaniel could respond, the front door of the house crashed open, followed by the heavy tread of boots on the wooden floor. "Search everything," Caldwell's cultured voice commanded. "The deed, the key, any documents relating to the Willow Pass property. And be thorough. Our friend Malcolm is nothing if not resourceful when it comes to hiding things." Nathaniel drew his pistol, positioning himself between Clara and the approaching men. "We need to leave," he whispered urgently. "Now." But it was too late. One of Caldwell's men had already entered the kitchen from the dining room, his surprise at finding them there quickly replaced by a predatory smile. "Well, well," he drawled, drawing his own weapon. "Look what we have here, boss," he called over his shoulder. "We've got company." Clara felt rather than saw Nathaniel tense, preparing for a confrontation that could only end badly given the odds against them. In that moment of crystal clarity, she made a decision. Stepping forward, she placed herself partially in front of Nathaniel, her hands open at her sides in a gesture of non-aggression. "Mr. Caldwell," she called, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her, "I believe we have matters to discuss." Caldwell appeared in the doorway, elegant as always in his city clothes, though his left arm was now supported by a sling, the result of Nathaniel's warning shot during their previous encounter. His eyes widened slightly at the sight of Clara, then narrowed with calculated assessment. "Mrs. Hargrove," he acknowledged with a slight bow, "this is an unexpected pleasure. I had thought you would be at your charming little cabin tending to your father." "My father is recovering well, thank you," Clara replied, maintaining the facade of civilized conversation, though every nerve in her body screamed for flight. "Dr. Harrison is quite skilled, despite his rural practice." Caldwell's smile never reached his eyes. "I'm delighted to hear it. Malcolm and I have unfinished business that would be most inconvenient to conclude with a funeral." Behind her, Clara could feel Nathaniel's tension, his readiness to act at the slightest provocation. She pressed back slightly with her elbow, a silent plea for patience. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, "we both know why you're here. The land at Willow Pass that once belonged to my mother." Caldwell raised an eyebrow, apparently intrigued by her directness. "Indeed. And what do you propose we do about this shared knowledge, Mrs. Hargrove?" "I propose a discussion like civilized people," Clara answered. "Not this, skulking about with armed men and threats of violence." For a moment, Caldwell seemed taken aback by her composure. Then he laughed, a sound containing genuine amusement. "You are remarkably like your mother," he observed. "Josephine never could abide what she called masculine posturing either." He gestured to his men who lowered their weapons slightly, though they remained watchful. Very well, Mrs. Hargrove. Let us discuss the matter like civilized people as you suggest, though I must insist that your husband's pistol be removed from the conversation. Clara glanced back at Nathaniel, who met her gaze with a mixture of concern and grudging respect for her approach. After a moment of silent communication, he slowly holstered his weapon, though his hand remained close to it. Excellent, Caldwell said, moving to the kitchen table and seating himself with the casual confidence of a man in his own home. Now shall we discuss terms? Clara took the chair opposite him, her back straight and her expression composed despite the rapid beating of her heart. Nathaniel remained standing positioned where he could watch both Caldwell and the men stationed at the doors. What exactly do you want, Mr. Caldwell? Clara asked, deciding that continued directness was her best strategy. The same thing I have wanted for 20 years, my dear. The 40 acres at Willow Pass that rightfully should have been mine. His smile faded, replaced by an expression of cold determination. Land that will shortly become the most valuable property in 3 territories once the railroad establishes its junction point there. The land belonged to my mother, Clara countered, inherited from her grandfather, never part of my father's ranch or his debts to you. Caldwell waved a dismissive hand. Legal technicalities. The Abernathy holdings have always been considered a single entity for practical purposes. Malcolm used the entire property as collateral for his loans, which I might add have never been repaid. He couldn't use what wasn't his to offer, Clara said firmly. And I have proof of my mother's sole ownership, the original deed, her grandfather's letters, documentation that places the land firmly outside any agreement my father might have made with you. Something flickered in Caldwell's eyes, concern perhaps, or calculation. Interesting claims, he said after a moment, but ultimately irrelevant. Even if what you say is true, the property now belongs to you as Josephine's heir, and you, my dear, are in no position to develop it as it deserves. And you are, Nathaniel spoke for the first time, his voice level, but edged with contempt. Caldwell's gaze shifted to him, cold and assessing. Indeed, Marshal Hargrove, or should I say former Marshal, I have the connections, the capital, and the vision to transform that worthless stretch of wilderness into a thriving commercial hub. What do you have? A borrowed cabin and a half-dead father-in-law with gambling debts larger than this territory's annual budget. Clara felt a surge of anger at his dismissive tone, but kept her expression neutral. If the land is so valuable, she said, then perhaps we should discuss a fair price for it. Caldwell's eyebrows rose in apparent surprise. You would sell voluntarily for the right price, Clara replied, ignoring Nathaniel's sharp glance. After all, as you say, we're in no position to develop it ourselves. A slow smile spread across Caldwell's face, the smile of a predator who believes his prey has finally surrendered. Now that Mrs. Hargrove is a sensible attitude, I'm prepared to offer a very generous sum, say $5,000. Clara maintained her composure, though inwardly she reeled at the amount. $5,000 was more money than most people in Cedar Ridge would see in a lifetime. It would clear her father's debts, provide for his care, and still leave enough for her and Nathaniel to build a comfortable life together. But something in Caldwell's too eager acceptance made her pause. If he was willing to offer such a sum without negotiation, the land must be worth far more than she had realized. That seems a fair starting point for discussion, she said carefully. But of course I would need to consult with my lawyer before agreeing to anything formal. Caldwell's smile faltered slightly. Your lawyer? Yes, Dr. Harrison has kindly arranged for us to meet with Judge Parker's legal representative in Denver next week. Since the property is currently involved in a dispute, it seems prudent to have proper legal counsel before proceeding with any sale. It was a bluff born of desperation and intuition, but Clara delivered it with the confident assurance of absolute truth. Beside her, Nathaniel had gone very still, but he gave no indication that her words were news to him. Caldwell studied her face, searching for signs of deception. Judge Parker, he repeated, a new note of caution in his voice. The federal judge. Clara nodded, allowing a small smile to touch her lips. The very same. It seems he has taken a particular interest in land transactions involving railroad development in the territories. Something about ensuring that proper procedures are followed and that all parties are treated equitably. The implication hung in the air between them that a federal judge was already aware of Caldwell's activities that legal scrutiny was imminent, that his carefully constructed scheme might be unraveling even as they spoke. For the first time, Clara saw uncertainty flicker across Victor Caldwell's composed features. He was a businessman, above all else she realized one who calculated risks and rewards with cold precision. And suddenly the equation had changed. "I see," he said finally, his tone neutral, but his eyes watchful. "Perhaps a more comprehensive discussion is indeed warranted before we proceed further." He rose from the table with the fluid grace that seemed to characterize all his movements. "I shall be in town for several more days, Mrs. Hargrove. When you have consulted with your legal advisors, perhaps we can resume our conversation." Clara stood as well, maintaining the pretense of civilized negotiation, though her knees felt weak with relief. "That seems reasonable, Mr. Caldwell. Though I should mention that the judge's representative was particularly interested in examining any promissory notes or loan agreements you might have with my father. For completeness, you understand." It was a final thrust aimed at the heart of Caldwell's operation. If his loan terms were as predatory as Nathaniel believed, if he had engaged in fraud or coercion to secure Malcolm's signature on those documents, federal scrutiny would be the last thing he wanted. Caldwell's smile had grown decidedly strained. "Of course. Transparency in all things, Mrs. Hargrove." He inclined his head in a gesture that might have been respect. "Your mother would have been proud of your negotiating skills." With that parting observation, he gestured to his men and departed, the sound of their horses fading gradually into the winter stillness. When they were truly gone, Clara's composure finally cracked. She sank back into the chair, her hands trembling, with delayed reaction to the danger they had just faced. "Judge Parker," Nathaniel said, a note of admiration in his voice as he moved to her side. "Federal scrutiny, legal representatives in Denver." "That was quite a performance, Mrs. Hargrove." Clara gave a shaky laugh. "I don't know where any of that came from. It just seemed like the right thing to say." "It was brilliant," Nathaniel assured her, kneeling beside her chair to take her cold hands between his warm ones. "You've bought us time to get to Denver to secure the evidence your mother left to build a case that even Caldwell's connections can't dismantle." Clara looked into her husband's face, seeing there not just admiration, but a new kind of respect, the recognition of an equal partner rather than someone to be protected. "We're going to win, aren't we?" she asked softly. "Not just survive this, but actually win." Nathaniel's smile was answer enough. "With you as our strategist, Caldwell doesn't stand a chance." The journey to Denver took 3 days of hard travel through snow-covered passes and along trails that existed more in memory than in visible reality. Clara and Nathaniel had left Malcolm in Martha and James Sullivan's care, the older couple, having insisted on moving the recovering man to their main house where he could be properly tended. "We'll watch over him as if he were our own." Martha had promised, her practical nature asserting itself in the face of Clara's concerns. "You two focus on dealing with Caldwell once and for all." Now, as they approached the outskirts of Denver, Clara felt a mixture of trepidation and determination. The territorial capital was by far the largest settlement she had ever seen, its streets bustling with activity despite the winter weather. Buildings of brick and stone rose 2 and 3 stories high, and the sound of construction echoed from all directions as the city continued its rapid expansion. "The bank should be on Lawrence Street," Nathaniel said as they navigated through the busy thoroughfares. "Not far from the territorial offices." Clara nodded, too overwhelmed by the noise and activity to respond verbally. After years of isolation at the ranch and weeks of peaceful existence in the Sullivan's cabin, the city's energy was both exhilarating and exhausting. The Denver City Bank occupied an imposing stone building with columns flanking its entrance, a deliberate statement of permanence and security in a city that had begun as a rough mining camp just 15 years earlier. Inside, the polished wood and brass fixtures continued the theme of solid respectability. A clerk approached as they entered, his professional smile faltering slightly as he took in their travel-worn appearance. "May I help you?" he inquired, his tone suggesting that he doubted his ability to do so. "We need access to a safe deposit box," Clara replied, drawing herself up with quiet dignity despite her plain dress and wind-chapped face. "My mother, Josephine Abernathy, maintained an account here." The clerk's expression shifted from doubt to surprise. "Abernathy, the singer." It was Clara's turn to be surprised. "You knew my mother." "Not personally," the clerk admitted, But my father spoke of her performances at the Diamond Theater, said she had the voice of an angel. He studied Clara's face more carefully. You have her eyes. The unexpected connection warmed Clara in a way she hadn't anticipated. Her mother had left a legacy beyond the land and legal papers, a memory of beauty and talent that lived on in the minds of those who had heard her sing. Thank you, she said simply. The clerk's manner became decidedly more helpful. If you have the key and can establish your identity as Mrs. Abernathy's heir, I'd be happy to assist you. And with Nathaniel's support in the documentation they had brought from Cedar Ridge, Clara was able to satisfy the bank's requirements. Soon they were escorted to a private room where the clerk presented them with a small metal box, Josephine's safe deposit box, untouched for 12 years. Take as much time as you need, the clerk said, leaving them alone with the bong and their thoughts. Clara stared at the container for a long moment, almost afraid to open it. This was the last direct link to her mother, the final message Josephine had left for her daughter. It's all right, Nathaniel said softly, understanding her hesitation. Whatever's in there, we'll face it together. With a deep breath, Clara inserted the key and lifted the lid. Inside lay several neatly organized packets of documents, each tied with ribbon and labeled in Josephine's elegant handwriting. On top was an envelope addressed simply for Clara. With trembling fingers, Clara opened it and began to read. My dearest daughter, if you are reading this, it means you have discovered the truth about the land at Willow Pass and have come to claim your inheritance. I always knew this day might come, though I prayed the circumstances would be happier than I fear they are. The documents enclosed will establish beyond any legal doubt that the property belongs solely to me, inherited from my grandfather, and never part of the Abernathy Ranch holdings. I have kept this arrangement secret from all but your father, knowing that someday this land might be all that stands between you and hardship. Victor Caldwell is a dangerous man, Clara. His cultured manners mask a ruthlessness that knows no bounds. He pursued me in St. Louis, not out of love, but out of a desire to possess, to own, to control. When I chose your father instead, a choice I have never regretted, despite the difficulties we have faced, Caldwell swore revenge. The railroad survey teams began appearing in our territory when you were just a child. I recognized immediately what it might mean for the future and what it would mean if Caldwell ever discovered the potential value of Willow Pass. That is why I have taken these precautions, why I have prepared this evidence for you. Use it wisely, my darling girl. Use it to secure your future, but never let the land or what it represents become more important than the life you choose to build. Money and property are merely tools, means to an end, not the end itself. Know that I have loved you every moment of your life, and that wherever I am now, I am watching over you with pride and joy. Your loving mother, Josephine. Clara lowered the letter, tears blurring her vision, but a newfound clarity settling in her heart. Her mother had prepared for this moment, had anticipated the challenges Clara would face and provided the tools to meet them. The other documents in the box were exactly what they needed: the original land grant from Josephine's grandfather, official survey maps showing the boundaries of the property, correspondence with territorial officials, confirming her sole ownership, even receipts for property taxes paid separately from the ranch assessments. It was an airtight case, meticulously documented and preserved. No court, not even one influenced by Caldwell's connections, could dispute Josephine's ownership or Clara's inheritance. This changes everything, Nathaniel said quietly, examining the papers with the trained eye of a former lawman. With these documents, we don't just have a defense against Caldwell's claims, we have leverage. Clara looked up from her mother's letter, a question in her eyes. Caldwell wants this land, Nathaniel explained. Wants it badly enough to spend 20 years pursuing it, to risk exposure of his methods, to come all the way to Cedar Ridge in person rather than sending agents. That gives us power. What are you suggesting? Clara asked, though she thought she already knew the answer. A trade, Nathaniel said simply. The land for something equally valuable to us. Justice for Thomas, Clara said softly. Exoneration for you. Freedom from fear for my father. Nathaniel nodded, his gray eyes reflecting the complex emotions the proposal stirred in him. It won't bring Thomas back. Nothing can do that. But it might give his death meaning, might finally close that chapter for both of us. Clara considered the suggestion, weighing it against her mother's words about using the land wisely, about not letting property become more important than the life they chose to build. What about the railroad? She asked. If the land is truly as valuable as everyone believes, We could sell it legitimately, Nathaniel finished for her, to the railroad directly or to developers without Caldwell's predatory history. Either way, it would provide more than enough to secure our future, to build the ranch we've talked about, to give your father the care he needs. The path forward was becoming clearer, a strategy taking shape that honored both her mother's legacy and the future she and Nathaniel hoped to create together. We'll need legal help, she said, making her decision. Someone who understands territorial law and has the authority to negotiate with the Caldwell from a position of strength. Nathaniel's smile held a hint of irony. As it happens, there actually is a Judge Parker who's been investigating land fraud cases in the territories. He was Thomas's uncle, the reason both of us joined the Marshals in the first place. Clara stared at him in astonishment. You mean my bluff wasn't entirely a bluff? Not entirely, Nathaniel admitted, though I doubt the judge has any specific interest in our situation, at least not yet. A plan was forming in Clara's mind, pieces falling into place with a clarity that surprised her. Then perhaps it's time we make him interested, she said. Time we finish what you and Thomas started. As they gathered the precious documents and prepared to leave the bank, Clara felt a sense of purpose stronger than any she had known before. This wasn't just about protecting their land or securing their future. It was about healing the wounds of the past, healing the broken relationships that had shaped her life, healing the community that had suffered under Caldwell's predatory practices. She thought of her father slowly recovering in the Sullivans' home, perhaps finally ready to let go of the bitterness that had consumed him for so long. She thought of her mother, whose foresight and courage had made this moment possible. And she thought of the song that had risen unbidden from her heart as she sat beside Malcolm's sickbed, the healing song that had somehow connected them across years of hurt and misunderstanding. There would be challenges ahead, confrontations with Caldwell, legal battles, the complex negotiations necessary to transform potential into reality. But for the first time, Clara felt truly equal to those challenges, not because she was perfect or all-knowing, but because she had finally found her voice, both literally and figuratively. As they stepped out into the bustling streets of Denver, Nathaniel took her hand, his touch warm and reassuring against the winter chill. Ready? He asked simply. Clara nodded, her expression serene but determined. Ready. Together they moved forward into whatever the future might hold. Their steps perfectly matched, their purposes aligned. Not as savior and saved, not as protector and protected, but as true partners in every sense of the word, each with their own strengths, each with their own healing, to do each essential to the journey they had begun together on that remarkable night in Cedar Ridge, when a tall stranger had crossed a crowded room to propose to a woman everyone else had overlooked. The healing song that had begun with that unlikely proposal would continue, its melody growing richer and more complex with each passing day, weaving together the disparate strands of their lives into something beautiful and enduring. And somewhere Clara thought her mother was listening and smiling and proud. 2 years later, the garden behind the Hargrove Ranch house bloomed with early summer flowers, their vibrant colors a testament to Clara's patient care. Roses climbed trellises built by Nathaniel's skilled hands, while neat rows of vegetables promised bounty for the coming months. Medicinal herbs grew in carefully tended beds ready to be harvested for the remedies that had made Clara's name known throughout the territory. On the porch, Malcolm Abernathy sat in a comfortable chair, his injured leg propped on a stool, but his overall appearance vastly improved from the bitter, brooding man he had once been. Beside him, a small girl of about 18 months played with wooden blocks, her dark curls and serious gray eyes marking her as Nathaniel's daughter, though her delicate hands and the hint of music in her laugh were pure Josephine. Hire Grandpa, the child demanded, holding up a block to add to the precarious tower they were building together. Malcolm obliged with a patience that still sometimes surprised Clara when she witnessed it. Her father would never be a demonstrative man. Too many years of practiced restraint had made that impossible. But in his quiet way, he had become a devoted grandfather to little Josephine, named for the grandmother she would never meet, but whose legacy lived on in so many ways. Clara watched from the kitchen window, a smile touching her lips as she observed the unlikely tableau. So much had changed in the 2 years since their confrontation with Caldwell, since their journey to Denver, since they had finally laid to rest the ghosts that had haunted both her family and Nathaniel's. The negotiations had been complex and occasionally tense, but in the end, Judge Parker's involvement had proven decisive. Faced with federal investigation into his business practices and the irrefutable evidence of Josephine's ownership of the Willow Pass property, Caldwell had eventually accepted the terms. They offered a clean slate in exchange for his testimony against larger fish in the land fraud schemes and a substantial but fair payment for the coveted 40 acres. The railroad had come through as predicted, transforming Cedar Ridge from an isolated settlement to a growing community with connections to markets across the territory. The proceeds from the land sale had allowed Clara and Nathaniel to build their own ranch, larger and more prosperous than Malcolm's had ever been, with enough left over to establish a small clinic where Clara practiced the healing arts she had inherited from her mother. Most surprising of all had been Malcolm's gradual transformation. The stroke that had followed his fever had left him partially disabled, dependent on Clara and Nathaniel in ways that would once have been intolerable to his pride. But instead of increasing his bitterness, the experience seemed to have broken through some internal dam, allowing him to finally begin the process of healing from decades of grief and self-recrimination. He would never be an easy man, never fully escape the shadows of his past mistakes, but he had found a measure of peace in his role as grandfather and occasional advisor on ranch matters, his knowledge of cattle and weather patterns still valuable despite his physical limitations. The sound of hoofbeats announced Nathaniel's return from town. Clara stepped onto the porch as he dismounted, noting with pleasure the easy grace that had first caught her attention all those months ago. Marriage and fatherhood had added new lines to his face, but they were the marks of joy rather than sorrow, of responsibility, willingly shouldered rather than burdens unwillingly imposed. "Any news?" she called as he secured his horse at the hitching post. Nathaniel looked up with a smile that still had the power to quicken her pulse. "Letter from Judge Parker," he replied, patting his vest pocket. "And Martha sends her regards. Says she'll be by tomorrow with that new fabric you ordered." He climbed the porch steps, pausing to ruffle little Josephine's curls and exchange a nod of greeting with Malcolm before joining Clara at the railing. "The judge says Caldwell's testimony secured convictions against 3 territorial officials and a railroad executive," he reported quietly. "The land fraud investigation is officially closed." Clara absorbed this information with a thoughtful nod. "So it's truly over then? All of it?" "All of it," Nathaniel confirmed. "Thomas can rest in peace, and so can your mother." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching as Malcolm helped Josephine place the final block atop their tower, the child's delighted laugh ringing out when the structure remained standing. "She asked me to sing to her last night," Clara said after a while. "Your daughter, I mean. The healing song, the one from the music box." Nathaniel's arms slipped around her waist, drawing her closer against the cooling evening air. "And did you come?" "I did." Clara's voice held a note of wonder even now when singing had become as natural to her as breathing. "It feels right somehow that she should know it, that the music should continue." "Just as your mother would have wanted," Nathaniel observed. "Just as you've made sure it has in so many ways." Clara leaned into his embrace, reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment, from a frightened, self-doubting girl to a confident healer, from a bitter, wounded man to a loving grandfather, from a vengeance-seeking ex-lawman to a content husband and father. None of them were perfect. All still carried scars from the past moments of doubt, occasional dark nights of the soul. But they had found their way to healing individually and together through love and forgiveness and the simple courage to keep moving forward despite pain. As the setting sun painted the mountains in shades of gold and rose, Clara began to hum softly the melody that had become her signature, her gift, her legacy. Little Josephine looked up at the sound, her serious face breaking into a smile of pure joy as she recognized her mother's voice. "Song, Mama," she called, abandoning her blocks to toddle across the porch. "Sing the pretty song." Clara lifted her daughter into her arms, feeling Nathaniel's steady presence beside her, aware of Malcolm's watchful gaze connected to her mother's memory through the music they shared. And as she began to sing, her voice clear and strong in the evening air, Clara knew that the healing song would continue long after this moment had passed, weaving its way through their lives like a golden thread binding past to present to future in an unbroken melody of love and redemption. Some wounds never fully healed, it was true. But with enough time, enough patience, enough love, even the deepest scars could become something beautiful, not despite the pain they represented, but because of it. In the gathering twilight, surrounded by the family she had found and created and healed, Clara Hargrove Grove sang her mother's song, and her own past and present, blending into a harmony as perfect as anything ever heard in the wild, beautiful territory they called home.